The parking lot went black before anyone understood what was happening. 7 tactical SUVs cut their headlights simultaneously, rolling to a stop in a coordinated arc around the emergency entrance of Harrow Creek General, silent, deliberate, like something out of a classified operation. Doors opened. Men in uniform stepped onto the wet asphalt. Not police, not federal agents, United States Navy, full dress. And at the front of that formation, a decorated commander with 30 years on his face walked straight past the automatic doors, past the stunned receptionist, past the charge nurse reaching for a phone, and stopped in front of a 54-year-old woman in faded blue scrubs holding a clipboard. He raised his hand to his brow. "Captain," he said quietly, "we've been looking for you for a long time. Before we go any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where stories like this one live. Stories about people who were written off, pushed out, and underestimated, until the moment the world had no choice but to see them clearly. If this is your kind of story, you're exactly where you need to be. Drop a like so this reaches more people who need to hear it, and tell me in the comments. What city, what country are you watching from right now? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The first thing people noticed about Margaret Osei was that she was always early, not the kind of early that announces itself, not the nurse who sweeps in with a travel mug and makes a performance of her punctuality. Margaret arrived before the shift change like the building itself expected her. Coat on a hook, bag in the same bottom locker, hands washed before anyone had finished logging out of the previous night. She moved quietly through the pre-dawn corridors of Harrow Creek General, the way water moves through familiar pipes, without friction, without fuss, without drawing attention. She had worked in the trauma unit for 6 years. She was 54. Her hair had gone mostly silver at the temples, cut short in a way that was practical rather than styled. Her badge said, Margaret Osei, RN, Trauma, and below that the unit number, and nothing else. No certifications listed, no honors, just the name and the role, same as everyone else. The younger staff had their own names for her. Nothing vicious, just the quiet, dismissive taxonomy that forms in any workplace when someone doesn't fit the mold. Old school. The dinosaur. One of the third-year residents, a fast-talking kid named Dr. Priya Anand, who had graduated top of her class and knew it, had taken to calling her the Relic when Margaret wasn't in earshot. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was the kind of careless label that sticks when no one bothers to look closely. Margaret had heard it. She'd heard all of them. She didn't say anything. What she did was work, methodically, precisely, without complaint. When a trauma bay filled up and 3 nurses were scrambling to manage 2 critical patients simultaneously, Margaret moved to the place she was needed before anyone asked. When a new resident froze on a hemorrhaging patient at 2 in the morning, Margaret put her hand on the resident's shoulder and said, very calmly, "Look at me. You've got this. Talk me through what you're seeing." Not because she was required to, because the patient needed it. She'd been doing this a long time, longer than most people in that building knew. The administrator who made her life difficult arrived in March. Dr. Conrad Voss was 41 years old, the new chief of medical operations, and he had come to Harrow Creek General from a hospital system in the Northeast with a mandate to modernize. That was the word he used constantly, modernize. In his first week, he sat in on 3 trauma cases and spent more time watching Margaret than watching the patients. Afterward, he called her into his office and told her that her technique was inconsistent with current best practices and that he'd be monitoring her performance closely. Margaret sat across the desk from him and listened without expression. "Do you have any questions?" he asked. "No," she said. "Do you understand the concerns I've outlined?" "I understand what you've said, yes." He waited for her to push back. She didn't. She stood, nodded once, and returned to the floor. That bothered him more than an argument would have. Over the following weeks, Voss found reasons to pull her aside after every major case. A notation in a patient chart that he characterized as incomplete. A triage decision he claimed fell outside her scope. The way she'd improvised a pressure management technique during a bad thoracic trauma that he said hadn't been cleared through proper channels. Each time, Margaret listened, acknowledged, and said very little. Each time, Voss left the conversation with the vague, nagging sense that he hadn't won anything. What he didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Margaret Osei was not a woman who needed to win arguments. She'd fought enough of them in places where the stakes were considerably higher than a hospital administrator's opinion. The case that changed everything started with a rainstorm. It had been building all afternoon, the sky over Harrow Creek pressing lower and lower until it opened up just after 8 in the evening. By 9:15, the roads south of town were underwater in 3 places, and the pileup on Route 9 involved 11 vehicles, 2 jackknifed freight trucks, and a school transport van that had gone sideways into a guardrail. 42 people in varying states of injury. The first ambulances arrived at Harrow Creek General at 9:42. The trauma unit went from quiet to catastrophic in under 4 minutes. Margaret was already pulling a second gurney into Bay 3 when the charge nurse started calling the all-hands. She had heard the radio traffic in the break room and had known, from the way the dispatcher's voice had tightened on certain words, that this was not going to be a manageable night. She had also noted, without registering it fully until much later, that 2 of the incoming patients were described as military contractors, returning from a training exercise at a facility north of the city. That detail settled somewhere in the back of her mind and stayed there. The first hour of a mass casualty event at a mid-sized regional hospital is controlled chaos. There are people who train for it, people who freeze in it, and people who seem to become most themselves precisely when it happens. Margaret was the third kind. She moved between bays with an economy of motion that looked, to the untrained eye, almost slow. But nothing she did was slow. Every step had a destination. Every decision was already made by the time her hands were moving. At 10:12, Bay 4 received a 38-year-old male with blunt abdominal trauma, a closed head injury, an internal hemorrhaging that wasn't showing on the initial scan the way it should have. The attending on the case was Dr. Anand, who was excellent under ordinary pressure and was visibly struggling under this kind. The patient's pressure was dropping faster than the medication was compensating, and Anand was staring at the monitor with the particular stillness of someone doing rapid math that wasn't adding up. Margaret came in behind her and looked at the patient, not the monitor, the patient, for about 3 seconds. "His left flank," she said. "Look at the discoloration just below the rib line. That's not presenting on the scan because the bleed is slow tracking. He needs an exploratory lap, and he needs it in the next 18 minutes, or you're losing him." Anand looked at the flank. The discoloration was there, subtle, easily missed at speed. "How did you—" "Get the OR on the line," Margaret said. "I'll prep him." Anand hesitated for exactly 1 second, then moved. She got the OR on the line. The surgery happened. The patient lived. 40 minutes later, Voss appeared in the trauma bay looking for Margaret. She was working a secondary patient, a woman from the van, broken clavicle, possible internal bruising, and did not look up when he came in. "Mrs. Osei?" He only ever called her that when he was in administrator mode. Never her title. "I'm with a patient," she said. "I understand that. I need a word when you're finished." "I'll be finished in about 10 minutes. He waited. I was not good at waiting, and his impatience gave off a specific kind of heat that Margaret had learned to identify in people who were accustomed to rooms organizing themselves around their presence. When she handed the patient off to a junior nurse and turned to face him, he didn't bother with softening. "The procedure in Bay 4, he said. "Dr. Anand's case." "What about it?" "You directed that patient towards surgery based on a visual assessment. That's not within your scope as a floor nurse, and you know that." "I offered a clinical observation to the attending physician," Margaret said. "She made the call." "That's not what Dr. Anand described." Anand, Margaret noted, was not in the room to speak for herself. "I suggested she look at the patient's flank," Margaret said. The rest was Dr. Anand's decision. The patient was prepped before the attending had formally ordered the OR. "The patient would have died if we'd waited for the formal order." Voss's jaw tightened. "That's not your determination to make." Apparently it was. It came out flatter than she intended, and she saw it land on him like a lit match. "Mrs. Osei," he said, dropping his voice in the way that administrators do when they want the conversation to feel like a warning. "I've been watching this pattern since I arrived. You override your colleagues. You act outside your designated role. You create liability exposure for this hospital and dress it up as intuition. I've been patient with you because your tenure here warranted it. But tonight—" He stopped, recalibrated. "Tonight confirms what I've been seeing, I'm recommending a formal performance review and a temporary reassignment off the trauma unit pending that review. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, not angry, not hurt. Something quieter and more contained than either. The patient in Bay 4, she said. Do you know his name yet? Voss blinked. That's not the... His name is on the intake sheet. You might want to look at it before you file your recommendation. She walked back to the floor. She didn't explain herself. She never did. That had always been both her greatest professional liability and the thing that kept her sane. The refusal to justify herself to people who had already decided what she was. What she hadn't said, because it wasn't the right time, and also because she had spent 6 years carefully not saying it. She had seen that specific presentation of a slow-tracking splenic bleed 11 times in her life. Not in textbooks, not in simulations, in field conditions, in places that didn't have scanners or attending physicians or OR teams on standby. In conditions where the discoloration below the rib line was the only data point you had, and you either read it correctly or the person in front of you went into irreversible shock while you were still deciding. She had read it correctly every time. 11 for 11, in locations she was not permitted to disclose. The suspension letter landed in her personnel file at 11:40. She was informed by the charge nurse, embarrassed, apologetic, that she was being reassigned to the administrative floor pending review, effective the following Monday. The charge nurse, a good woman named Deshawn, who had worked alongside Margaret for 4 years, couldn't quite meet her eyes. I'm sorry, Deshawn said. I pushed back, for what it's worth. I know you did, Margaret said. Don't worry about it. She finished her shift. She charted every patient, completed every handoff, updated every file. She did not leave a single thing undone. At 2:17 in the morning, with the rain still hammering the roof, and the trauma bay quieter now, just the hum of equipment and the occasional voice from the nurse's station, Margaret sat in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and read through the suspension notice once. Her expression didn't change. She had been dismissed before. She had been underestimated, questioned, redirected, and removed from situations she was more qualified to handle than anyone else in the room. This was not the first time. It wasn't even close to the worst time. She put the letter in her bag, finished the cold coffee, and was about to stand when Deshawn appeared in the doorway with a look on her face that Margaret recognized immediately as the look of someone delivering information they didn't understand yet. There's something happening out front, Deshawn said. What kind of something? Military. A lot of it. Deshawn paused. They asked for you by name, not your employee name. They used a different name. Margaret set down the cup very carefully. What name did they use? Deshawn looked at the paper in her hand, as if she needed to confirm she'd read it correctly. Captain, she said. They asked for Captain Margaret Osei. The break room was quiet. The rain hit the window in irregular bursts. Margaret stood up slowly, smoothed the front of her scrubs, and walked out of the room. The lobby of Harrow Creek General was not a large space. A regional hospital serving a mid-sized city didn't require grand architecture. But it felt smaller than usual, and it felt smaller because 7 men in Navy dress uniform were standing in it, taking up the particular kind of space that comes not from physical size, but from absolute stillness. They weren't at parade rest. They weren't performing anything. They were simply present, in the way that people are present when they've come somewhere with a clear purpose. The man at the front had the face of someone who had made difficult decisions in difficult places and had learned to live with every one of them. He was perhaps 60, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that military service installs in a person so deeply it never fully leaves. When he saw Margaret come through the internal doors, he straightened, an almost imperceptible shift, and raised his right hand to his brow. Captain Osei, he said. The lobby was quiet enough that everyone within 20 feet heard it clearly. Behind the reception desk, the night shift administrator had stopped typing. Deshawn, who had followed Margaret out, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Margaret stopped 3 feet in front of the commander and looked at him steadily. Commander Ashby, she said. It's been a while. Yes. She glanced at the men behind him, reading faces quickly the way she had always read everything quickly. How bad is it? Petty Officer Tran is in surgery right now, Bay 4. He went in about an hour ago. Ashby paused. He was the one you flagged for the exploratory lap. The silence that followed that sentence had a particular texture. He came around briefly in transport, Ashby continued. Enough to say one thing to the corpsman. He said, "Find her." He gave your name, the name we knew you by. Something moved in the commander's expression. Not quite a smile, not quite grief, something between them. Took us 40 minutes to cross-reference that with the civilian records. Your cover's thorough, Captain. But his was a very specific request. Margaret said nothing for a moment. How do you know it's the same person? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Ashby reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a photograph. He held it out to her. She took it, looked at it. It was her. Younger. Not by a small margin. In the photograph, she was wearing field gear, not scrubs, standing outside a forward medical station somewhere with a landscape that had no reference points a civilian would recognize. Beside her was a young man, 19, maybe 20, looking at the camera with the particular expression of someone who has just survived something and hasn't fully processed it yet. She remembered that day. She remembered exactly what had happened that day. He kept this? She said. Apparently. She handed the photograph back. Behind her, she was aware that the lobby had acquired additional observers. The night supervisor, 2 nurses who'd been heading home, the janitor who cleaned the corridors between 2 and 4 in the morning, and who had stopped his cart near the hallway entrance and was watching with open curiosity, and Conrad Voss, who had appeared from somewhere, possibly still in the building finalizing his recommendation, and was standing near the corridor to the administrative wing with an expression she couldn't fully read from this distance, but which contained the particular quality of a man encountering something that doesn't fit the framework he's been operating inside. She turned back to Ashby. He's going to be all right, she said. The surgery is straightforward. The attending on the case is Dr. Anand, and she's excellent. I know, Ashby nodded. We're not here for the surgery, Captain. Then why are you here? He looked at her directly. Because the record needs to be set straight, and because Marcus Tran asked us to be. She studied his face for a moment. That's not your call to make, she said carefully, and it's certainly not mine. No, Ashby agreed, but it's his, and he made it before he went under. He glanced briefly at the corridor behind her, in the direction of Voss, she realized, and then back to her. We're not leaving until we've said what needs to be said. The lobby of Harrow Creek General at 2:30 in the morning had the particular quality of a space holding its breath. Margaret Osei stood in the middle of it, in her faded blue scrubs, with her employee badge that listed only her name and unit number and nothing else, and looked at the row of men in dress uniform who had driven through a storm to find her. She had spent 6 years making herself small in this building, 6 years letting the Vosses of the world file their reports and schedule their reviews and use their institutional authority as a blunt instrument against competence they were too insecure to properly evaluate. She had done it because she'd wanted the quiet life. She had earned the right to the quiet life. She had paid for it in ways that didn't fit neatly into any personnel file. But Marcus Tran was in Bay 4, 19 years old the first time she'd seen him. 38 now, apparently, which meant time had continued passing while she wasn't watching it, and he had gone into surgery with enough consciousness left to ask for her. She exhaled slowly. All right, she said, not in the lobby. There's a family consultation room on the 2nd floor that's empty at this hour. We can talk there. She turned toward the elevator without looking at Voss. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the room, the way the air changes when a story that was going one direction suddenly goes another. She had felt it before, in smaller rooms, in darker places. The moment when the version of events that the powerful people have agreed upon starts to develop cracks too large to paper over. She pressed the elevator button. The door opened. And somewhere above her, in a surgical bay that smelled of antiseptic and warmed saline, a man who had trusted her with his life twice was breathing steadily under general anesthesia, not knowing yet what she had already done for him tonight, or what the men downstairs were about to do for her. Not knowing yet what she had already done for him tonight, or what the men downstairs were about to do for her. The elevator opened on the 2nd floor to a corridor that smelled of floor cleaner and recycled air. The overhead lights dimmed to the nighttime setting that gave everything a slightly underwater quality. Margaret walked ahead of the group without looking back to confirm they were following. She knew they were. She could hear the particular cadence of military footfall, even in a carpeted hospital hallway, even in dress shoes rather than boots. There was a rhythm to it that she recognized the way other people recognized music they'd grown up hearing. The family consultation room was at the end of the hall, past the cardiac ward, and a small waiting area with chairs arranged around a television that was cycling through a muted weather broadcast. She pushed the door open, hit the light switch, and stood aside while Commander Ashby and two of his men entered. The others remained in the corridor, a decision Ashby made with a single hand gesture that the men obeyed without question or discussion. The room was not designed for this kind of meeting. It was designed for delivering bad news to people who were already in shock. Soft chairs, a box of tissues on the side table, a painting of a lake on the wall that was meant to be calming, and mostly just looked like it had been chosen by someone who had never experienced actual grief. Margaret pulled one of the chairs out from the low table and sat in it the way she sat in most chairs. Forward, not back, weight on the front edge, occupying as little space as possible. Ashby sat across from her. His two men stood near the door. He put a folder on the table. He didn't open it immediately. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Harrow Creek, 6 years. Before that?" "St. Augustine's in the valley, 2 years. Before that I took some time." "How much time?" "About a year." She paused. "I needed a year." He nodded slowly, and in that nod was an acknowledgement of something that didn't need to be stated directly. That the kind of work she'd done before the civilian life had a cost that was specific and non-transferable, and that a year was not very long to pay it. "Marcus wasn't the only one who kept track of you," Ashby said. "You should know that." "I'd rather not know it, actually." "I understand, but it's true." He leaned forward slightly. "There are 9 men and 4 women still active who completed their advanced trauma training under your instruction in the 12 months before you separated. Every one of them has, at some point in the last 6 years, asked where you went. And what did you tell them? That you'd made a choice, and that the choice deserved to be respected." He paused. That held for a while, until Marcus got hurt tonight and decided it didn't hold anymore. Margaret looked at the folder on the table. "What's in that?" "Some of it you know, some of it might surprise you." He tapped the cover. "We'll get to it. First, I need to know what happened tonight, before we arrived. The full version." She almost said the full version isn't your business, but she didn't. Because Marcus Tran was lying in a surgical bay 1 floor below them, and the man sitting across from her had driven through a rainstorm with 6 other people because a soldier who trusted her had asked him to, and that deserved something more than deflection. So she told him. She told him about Voss, about the pattern of it, the slow erosion, the way institutional authority operates when it's wielded by someone who is more threatened by competence than interested in it. She kept it factual, stripped of editorial. She told him about Bay 4, about Anand, about the call she'd made on the bleed and what it had cost her within the hour. She told him about the suspension letter in her bag, which she hadn't read again since the break room, and didn't intend to until she was ready to deal with it in the morning. Ashby listened without interrupting. One of his men near the door had produced a small notepad at some point and was writing things down. She noticed it and didn't object. When she finished, Ashby was quiet for a moment. "The patient in Bay 4, he said. "Before you knew who he was. You made the same call you would have made for anyone." "Yes, because you read the presentation. Because I've seen it before and I knew what it meant." 11 times, Ashby said. She looked at him. "I read your field reports," he said simply. "All of them, years ago, when you were still active. 11 splenic presentations in austere environments. 11 correct calls. No imaging, no OR, no attending on backup." He let that sit. "And tonight, in a fully equipped regional trauma center, your administrator filed a performance review because you used the same skill set to save the same kind of injury. It's more complicated than that." "It always is." He opened the folder. "Which is why this needs to stop being your problem alone." What was inside the folder was not what she expected. She had assumed in the elevator that this was going to be a record retrieval, the Navy producing documentation of her service history to validate her clinical background in the face of Voss's review. A professional credential play. Clean, procedural. The kind of institutional machinery she understood. It wasn't that. The top sheet was a formal complaint, already filed with the state medical board, bearing a case number and a timestamp from earlier that evening, before the accident on Route 9, before any of tonight's events. The complaint was against Harrow Creek General's Chief of Medical Operations, and it contained a detailed account of clinical interference, scope manipulation, and documented patient endangerment across 17 cases over the past 8 months. Margaret read the first page, then the second. "This isn't about me," she said. "No," Ashby said, "not entirely." "Who filed this?" "The families of 3 patients who died in cases where the clinical record doesn't match the care provided, and 2 nurses who were terminated in the last 4 months." He paused. "One of them is a former corpsman. She reached out to us 3 weeks ago because she recognized something in the incident reports. The way certain decisions were being attributed, the way documentation was being revised after the fact. It's a pattern she'd seen before, in a different context." Margaret set the pages down on the table. "You've been watching this hospital," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization. "We've been watching Conrad Voss," Ashby said, "since before he came to Harrow Creek. His previous posting had similar irregularities, nothing that rose to a criminal threshold on its own. But the pattern across institutions—" He shook his head. "The board complaint is the formal piece. There's also an inquiry from the State Health Authority, and as of 6 hours ago, an interest from the Federal Health Oversight Division, because 2 of the patient files involved individuals who were receiving care under military health coverage." Margaret sat back in the chair for the first time. She looked at the ceiling, the drop tiles, the fluorescent panel, the generic institutional nothing of it, and breathed out slowly through her nose. "He was going to move me to administrative," she said, "off the floor." "Yes." "Which would have removed me from any cases where I might observe what he was doing." "That's the working theory. And Marcus Tran coming in tonight changes the timeline," Ashby said, "because now there are questions being asked about who flagged the injury correctly, and why the person who flagged it was simultaneously being suspended for overstepping her role." He looked at her steadily. "The performance review Voss filed creates a paper trail he didn't intend to create. It puts your clinical judgment in documented opposition to his administrative authority at the exact moment a federal patient is being treated. That's not a favorable position for him to be in right now." The consultation room was very quiet. Margaret thought about Deshawn's face when she delivered the suspension notice. The embarrassment in it, the apology. Deshawn had been watching Voss operate for 8 months and had not had the framework to name what she was seeing. She thought about Anand, who was excellent and ambitious, and who had, Margaret now realized, been navigating Voss's management style by making herself smaller and faster and more deferential than her training warranted. She thought about the 2 nurses who had been terminated. She didn't know their names. That felt wrong. "The nurses who were let go," she said. "What are their names?" Ashby checked the folder. "Patterson and Reeves." "I don't recognize Patterson." "Reeves? Is that Sandra Reeves? Dark hair? About my height? Worked the overnight trauma rotation?" "That's her." Margaret remembered Sandra Reeves. Capable, direct, occasionally impatient in the way that competent people become impatient when surrounded by process that serves administration rather than patients. She had left in November, and the official reason had been restructuring of overnight staffing, and no one on the floor had believed it, but no one had said anything loud enough to matter. "She needs to be part of whatever comes next," Margaret said. "She's already been contacted," Ashby said. "She's cooperating with the inquiry." There was a knock at the consultation room door. One of the men near the wall opened it, and a young officer stepped in and leaned close to Ashby's ear. Ashby nodded twice, then looked at Margaret. "Surgery's finished," he said after Dr. Anand's closing. "Marcus is stable." Something she'd been holding in her chest without realizing it released. "Good," she said. It came out quieter than she meant it to. "He's going to want to see you," Ashby said, "when he's out of recovery." "That's his choice." "I know. I'm telling you so you're not caught off guard." She looked at him. "I've been caught off guard twice in the last 4 hours, Commander. I think I've met my quota." It was the first thing she'd said all night that had any warmth in it, and it surprised both of them slightly. Ashby almost smiled. Almost. "There's one more thing," he said, and reached into the folder again. This time, what he produced was a single sheet. Not official, not a form, not stamped or case numbered. It was handwritten. The handwriting was uneven, pressured in places. The kind of writing that happens when someone is working against a physical limitation and is determined to get the words down anyway. He held it out. She took it. It was addressed to her. Not to Captain Osei. Not to the nurse in Bay 4. Just to Margaret, in the way that people who know you well enough dispense with titles entirely. She read it without moving. The room was quiet enough that the building's ventilation system was audible, a low, consistent push of recycled air through the vents near the ceiling. When she finished, she folded the paper once and held it in both hands with a steadiness that was not effortless but was practiced. "He wrote this in the ambulance?" she asked. "He dictated it to the corpsman. The corpsman wrote it down." Ashby paused. "He had to stop twice, but he finished it." She didn't ask what the stopping was about. She understood what kind of physical state Marcus Tran had been in during that ambulance ride, and she understood what it cost a person to push through that state to finish a sentence they'd decided needed finishing. She put the letter in the pocket of her scrubs, against her chest. "All right," she said, and stood. Ashby stood as well. "What happens now isn't your burden to carry alone," he said. "I want you to understand that clearly." "I've been carrying things alone for a long time," she said. "Old habit." "I know, but this one has more people attached to it than you're aware of." She picked up her badge from where it had slipped to the table's edge, clipped it back to her scrub top, and moved toward the door. In the corridor, the other 4 men were exactly where they'd been, unhurried, present, patient in the particular way of people who understand that some things take the time they take, and rushing them doesn't change the outcome. She walked back toward the elevator without any clear plan about what she was going to do when she reached the ground floor. She knew Voss was still in the building. The suspension notice had been filed digitally, which meant he was likely in his office or near the administrative wing, doing the kind of paperwork that people do when they want a paper trail that validates their version of events before any other version can gain traction. She knew that what was in Ashby's folder changed the weight of that paperwork significantly. She also knew that institutional machinery moves slowly, and that a federal inquiry and a state board complaint, however serious, did not mean that Conrad Voss would walk out of Harrow Creek General tomorrow morning having lost anything. He had lawyers. He had the board's procedural deference. He had 8 months of maneuvering that had been careful enough to survive this long. The elevator opened on the ground floor. The lobby was different than it had been 40 minutes ago. The receptionist at the night desk had been joined by the hospital's weekend manager, a man named Gary Ostrowski, who was technically on call, but who Margaret had never seen actually called at 2 in the morning before. Ostrowski was talking to one of Ashby's men near the main entrance with the expression of someone doing extremely rapid calculations about institutional liability. 2 of the nurses who had been heading home were still there, standing near the vending alcove, not pretending to have a reason to stay, but not leaving either. Deshawn was at the nurses' station. She looked up when Margaret came off the elevator, and her face did something complicated. "He's stable," Margaret said before Deshawn could ask. "Thank God." She paused, caught herself. I'm really glad." "So am I." Deshawn looked past her at the men in uniform filtering out of the elevator behind her, then back to Margaret. "What's happening?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," Margaret said, "but I think you should document every interaction you've had with Voss in the last 8 months, formally, in writing, starting tonight." Deshawn's eyes sharpened. "Is this about the Patterson thing? And Sandra?" "It might be connected, yes. I've been thinking about that for months. I didn't think—" She stopped. "I know," Margaret said. "Document it anyway. Timestamp it. Don't edit." She moved toward the trauma unit, not because she was back on shift. She wasn't, technically, she was suspended, but because there were still patients in those bays who had come in tonight and whose care she understood better than anyone currently on the floor, and because the suspension notice in her bag had not yet been formally processed, which meant she was still technically on hospital grounds in a professional capacity, and she was going to be useful for exactly as long as that technicality held. She pushed through the trauma unit doors. The bay that had been Marcus Tran's was empty now, cleaned and reset, the gurney stripped and remade with the speed that hospital support staff develop when efficiency is the only option. Bay 3 held a teenager with a broken femur who was sleeping through a morphine drip. Bay 2 had an older man, the driver of one of the freight trucks she'd learned earlier, who had come through the windshield and was concussed and lacerated across the scalp, but otherwise intact in ways that were frankly improbable. Bay 1 was empty. She moved to the central station and pulled up the active chart on the truck driver, reviewing the overnight notes with the automatic attention of someone for whom other people's charting is a readable language. The resident at the station, a second-year named Tobias, who looked like he hadn't slept since Thursday, glanced at her, and then back at his screen with the look of someone choosing not to ask questions. "Anything I should know about 14B?" she asked, not looking up from the chart. "Pressure's been consistent since 11, Tobias said. "He's been asking for his dog." "His dog is presumably not in the hospital." "No, his wife's been called. She's about 2 hours out." A pause. "He keeps asking anyway." "Noted in the chart. It matters." "Does it?" When people wake up disoriented after head trauma and they have a fixation on something, a person, an animal, a specific object, that fixation is usually the thing closest to the core of who they are. If he's asking for the dog is what's going to stabilize him when he surfaces properly. Note it. Tell the wife when she arrives. She handed the tablet back. "It matters." Tobias wrote it down. She moved through the rest of the bay, checking monitors, adjusting a drip rate on the teenager that was slightly high for her weight, noting a respiratory irregularity on the truck driver that could be managed conservatively or could be the early edge of something that would need intervention in the next 2 to 3 hours. She flagged it in the chart with a note detailed enough that whoever came on after her would have everything they needed to make the call. She did not think about Voss. She did not think about the folder Ashby had laid on the consultation room table. She did not think about the letter folded against her chest, or about what Marcus Tran had dictated to a corpsman in an ambulance while bleeding internally at a rate that should, by clinical probability, have made coherent speech impossible. She thought about the patients in front of her and what they needed next. That was the work. That had always been the work. At 4 in the morning, she became aware that she was not alone. She had been aware of the lobby's changed energy for some time, the sound levels, the movement at the periphery, but she had been focused and had not tracked it closely. Now, stepping out of Bay 3 after checking the teenager's vitals, she looked toward the internal corridor and saw that there were people in the hallway who were not hospital staff. Not the Navy men, different people. A man and a woman in civilian clothes with the specific posture of people who are working, not waiting, working. The woman was on a phone, the man was reviewing something on a tablet. They were not visible to the administrative wing from this angle, which Margaret suspected was not accidental. Behind them, further down the corridor, she could see Gary Ostrowski in conversation with a person she didn't recognize at all, younger, with a lanyard that wasn't the hospital's standard issue, and a carry bag that looked more like a document case than anything medical. She looked at all of this for about 4 seconds. Then Commander Ashby appeared at her left elbow, which she had not heard him approach, and which told her she was more tired than she'd assessed. "State health investigator," he said quietly, nodding toward the woman on the phone. "The man with the tablet is from the Federal Oversight Office. They were already en route when we got here. The inquiry had already been escalated before tonight. Marcus being admitted here just—" he paused, accelerated the timeline. "How much of this was already in motion?" she asked. "More than you know." "That's not an answer. It's the honest one." He glanced at the corridor. "Voss is still in his office. He hasn't been informed yet that the investigators are here." "When?" "Probably within the hour." She processed this. The hour. Voss sitting at his desk, filing his paperwork, building his version of tonight's events, unaware that the version was becoming irrelevant in real time, that the machinery he'd been operating inside had developed a fracture he couldn't paper over, because the fracture had been documented from the outside by people with authority he couldn't reassign or suspend. She felt something that was not satisfaction. She didn't have the energy for satisfaction, and she wasn't sure she'd have had it anyway. It was more like recognition, the specific feeling of watching a system correct itself after a long misalignment. Not clean, not simple, but directionally right. "There's something else," Ashby said. She looked at him. "The board member who approved Voss's original appointment," he said. "We have documentation that suggests the appointment bypassed 2 qualified internal candidates, and that Voss's references were not independently verified the way the process required." He stopped. "One of the bypassed candidates was a woman who'd been with the hospital for 11 years. She left the field entirely after she didn't get the role. Her name was Dolores Webb." Margaret didn't know that name, but she knew the shape of what Ashby was describing. She had seen it before, in smaller forms. The quiet structuring of systems to produce specific outcomes while maintaining the appearance of process. The genius of it was that it looked procedural. It looked like institutional rigor, until you pulled one thread and the whole weave came apart. "Is Webb part of the inquiry?" she asked. She will be. Someone should call her. Someone already has. She turned back toward the bay. She was going to keep working. That was the only thing that made sense to her right now. To keep working until someone formally told her she couldn't, or until the morning shift arrived, or until whatever was building in the corridors of this hospital at 4 in the morning reached whatever conclusion it was building toward. She had taken 3 steps when the trauma unit doors opened from the corridor side and Dr. Priya Anand walked in. Anand was still in surgical gear, hadn't changed, probably hadn't stopped moving since Bay 4. She looked like someone who had been running on adrenaline for 3 hours and was now becoming acquainted with what existed on the other side of adrenaline. She spotted Margaret and crossed the bay without hesitation. "He's in recovery," she said. "I heard. Thank you." Anand stopped. She looked at Margaret with an expression that had several things in it that she was clearly working out how to say, and this was not a woman who typically struggled to say things. "The call you made," she said finally. "On the flank." "You made the call," Margaret said. "I offered an observation." "Don't." Anand's voice was short. Not angry, something more effortful than anger, the sound of someone insisting on accuracy. "I've been practicing medicine for 9 years and I missed that presentation. You saw it in about 3 seconds and you knew exactly what it was." She paused. "Where did you—" She stopped herself. Looked at the door, where Ashby was visible in the corridor beyond, looked back. "He kept saying your name in pre-op. He was barely conscious and he kept saying it." "He was a former patient," Margaret said. "From here?" "No, from before." Anand absorbed this. She looked at Margaret the way she had probably looked at texts in medical school that contained more information than the surface reading suggested, turning it over, looking for the full weight of it. "The military records," she said carefully. "Ashby said something about military records when I passed him in the hall. He said your clinical expertise had been documented in environments that—" She paused. "He said austere environments." That was the phrase. It was. How austere? Priya. It was the first time Margaret had used her first name, and it landed with a quietness that Anand clearly registered. "There's going to be a process. Formal. You'll hear what you need to hear through that. Tonight." She looked at the bay around them, the monitors, the 2 sleeping patients, the resident still at the station trying not to appear like he was listening. "Tonight I need you to do something for me." "What?" "Write up the Bay 4 case, exactly as it happened. Your own words, your own recollection, time-stamped, before you sleep on it, and before anyone from administration suggests how to frame it. The full account." Anand stared at her. "Is something happening with Voss?" "Just document the case," Margaret said. "Accurately. Tonight." The look that crossed Anand's face was complicated. Something between understanding and alarm and the particular expression of a person who had been half aware of a problem for a long time and was now confronting the possibility that their half-awareness had been a form of complicity. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." She left through the trauma unit doors, and her footsteps in the corridor were quick and purposeful, heading back toward the surgical wing. Margaret stood in this bay for a moment in the particular stillness of a night that had gone far past what any reasonable person would call a shift. She was suspended. She was operating on somewhere between 2 and 3 hours of sleep from the night before. There were federal investigators in the corridor, military personnel in her lobby, a state inquiry gathering momentum in the administrative wing, and a man in the recovery room 1 floor up who had found her name in his memory at the moment when the cost of keeping things inside had become higher than the cost of saying them out loud. And in his office at the end of the administrative corridor, Conrad Voss was still writing his report. The door to the trauma unit opened from the corridor. Not a nurse, not a physician. Conrad Voss stepped into the trauma bay in his administrator's jacket, and he looked around the room with the sharp, scanning quality of a man who has arrived somewhere and is rapidly assessing how much of what he expected to find is actually present. He found Margaret. His expression went through 3 things in quick succession: surprise, recalibration, and something harder that settled into place with the deliberate quality of a decision being made in real time. "Mrs. Osei," he said, "you're not on the schedule." "No," she said. "The suspension notice was filed 4 hours ago." "I'm aware." "Then I don't understand why you're standing in my trauma unit at 4 in the morning." The bay was very quiet. The monitors hummed. The teenager in Bay 3 breathed steadily through her morphine. The truck driver shifted in his sleep and said something that wasn't quite a word. Margaret looked at Voss and thought about the folder on the consultation table upstairs. She thought about the woman on the phone in the corridor. She thought about Sandra Reeves and Dolores Webb and the names of 3 patients whose families had filed complaints before tonight. She thought about all of the things that were moving in this building right now, quietly, with the specific efficiency of institutional processes that have gathered enough evidence to act. She thought about saying none of this to Conrad Voss. She said something else instead. "Your investigators are here," she said. "Not mine. The state's." Voss went very still. "They're in the corridor outside administrative," she said. "They've been here for about 20 minutes. I'd estimate you have another 30 before someone formally notifies you, but that's a guess." The color in Voss's face shifted in a way she had seen before. And people who have built something carefully over time and have just heard the specific sound of it beginning to come down. "What investigators?" he said, and his voice was nearly steady. "Nearly." "You should go find out," Margaret said. "I have patients to monitor." She turned back to the bay. Behind her, she heard the trauma unit doors open and then close, and then the particular sound of footsteps moving fast down a corridor. Not running, not quite, but close, in the direction of the administrative wing. She exhaled. The monitors kept humming. In the recovery room, Marcus Tran's blood pressure held steady at numbers that said he was going to make it through the night and through the weeks after that, and probably quite a few years beyond that, though no one in the building knew yet what those years were going to look like, or what the morning was going to look like, or what was going to happen when the sun came up over Harrow Creek and the administrative wing opened its doors to people who were holding a great deal of carefully assembled paperwork and the authority to use it. Margaret knew one thing. She was done being small. She didn't announce it. She didn't say it out loud to anyone in the room. She just stood in the trauma bay with her badge and her faded scrubs, monitoring 2 patients who needed her, and let the knowledge settle into her the way certainties do when they've been true for a long time and have finally run out of reasons to hide. At 4:47 in the morning, every light in the administrative wing of Harrow Creek General came on at once. Part 3. At 4:47 in the morning, every light in the administrative wing of Harrow Creek General came on at once. Margaret saw it from the trauma bay, the sudden brightness bleeding under the internal corridor door, visible even from where she stood, the kind of light that doesn't belong to night shift protocol. The monitors kept their rhythms. The truck driver kept sleeping. She kept her hands moving on the chart she was updating, because the chart needed updating, and because standing still in the direction of whatever was happening in that corridor was not going to change its outcome. Tobias looked up from his station. He'd been awake long enough that his responses to stimulus had slowed perceptibly. Not dangerous, just tired. "What is that?" he asked. "Administrative," Margaret said. "At 5 in the morning? Apparently." He looked at her in the way that young residents sometimes looked at her, like she was a terrain feature that had been there longer than the road, and might know something about where the road was going. She didn't elaborate. What she knew was this: the investigators had moved from the corridor. The state woman who'd been on the phone and the federal man with the document case had gathered Ostrowski and had gone, and the going had a quality of intention that suggested they were not waiting for morning. Conrad Voss had gone in the same direction 11 minutes earlier, walking fast without running, which was the specific speed of a man who still believed he had time to control a situation that had already moved past him. She finished the chart, filed it, and pulled up the respiratory note she'd flagged on the truck driver. The irregularity was still there on the monitor, periodic, shallow, the kind of thing that could be managed another 4 hours, or could tip into something requiring intervention. And the determining factor was usually a combination of patient weight, existing respiratory history, and the specific character of the irregularity's interval. She studied it for about 90 seconds and decided it was going to hold, but flagged it for the morning, attending anyway with a note specific enough to be actionable. Then she heard the voices. Not loud, not arguing, not yet, but audible through the corridor door in the distinctive way that voices carry through institutional space when multiple people are speaking with purpose in a room that doesn't normally contain that much directed energy. She couldn't make out words. She could make out tone, and the tone had the quality of several conversations happening simultaneously with the particular organizational chaos of a formal process being applied to a situation that the participants had been building toward for weeks and had now reached its first point of contact. Deshawn came through the trauma unit doors at 5:03, still in her scrubs from the previous shift, which told Margaret she hadn't gone home. Voss's assistant just called every board member, Deshawn said, without preamble. The ones she could reach at this hour anyway. I heard her in the hallway before the administrative doors closed. Which board members? I don't know. She was going through a list. She looked terrified. Margaret considered this. Voss was lawyering up in the only way immediately available to him, activating the institutional relationships that had protected his decisions for 8 months. It was a reasonable move. It might even buy him time. Board members, reached at 5 in the morning and told something vague and alarming, tend to respond by closing ranks first and asking questions second. Who's the board chair? Margaret asked. Miriam Holst, Deshawn said. She's been chair for 4 years. I don't know what she knows about any of this. Is she local? She lives about 20 minutes out. Margaret took this in. 20 minutes. If Voss's assistant had reached Holst, Holst was either on the phone with lawyers or in her car. Either way, the board's initial response was going to reach the administrative wing before the investigators had finished their first formal hour of documentation. Go home, Deshawn, she said. I'm not going home. You've been here since yesterday afternoon. So have you. Deshawn looked at her with the specific stubbornness of someone who has decided they're part of a situation whether or not they were invited. I've been writing down everything you told me to write. Every case I can remember, every date, every time Voss came in here and made a call he had no business making. I've got 3 pages. I want someone official to have it. Give it to the woman in the gray jacket when you find her. State investigator. Don't give it to Ostrowski. Why not Ostrowski? Because Ostrowski approved 2 of Voss's staffing decisions, and right now I don't know whose side he's on. Deshawn's jaw tightened. Okay. She paused. What about you? Are you okay? It was such a plain question, asked in such a plain way, that it caught Margaret slightly off-center. She looked at Deshawn, this woman who had worked beside her for 4 years, who had delivered the suspension notice with her eyes down, who had stayed in the building until 5 in the morning, writing notes on a yellow legal pad because it was the right thing to do. I'm fine, Margaret said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. Deshawn nodded and went to find the woman in the gray jacket. At 5:20, Commander Ashby reappeared. He came through the trauma unit doors with less of the deliberate quiet he'd carried earlier. Not hurried, but the pace of a man moving through a situation that was developing and required presence. The board chair is here, he said. Margaret looked up. Holst? Arrived 6 minutes ago. She came directly to the administrative wing, not the lobby. Someone let her in through the side entrance. He paused. She brought someone with her. A man we're not certain of yet. Not legal counsel. His identification is different. He's been on the phone since they arrived. Different how? State level, possibly the commissioner's office. This changed the shape of the next few hours considerably. The commissioner's office had a different relationship to the state health authority inquiry than the hospital board did. They could either accelerate the process or complicate it, depending on where their interests aligned, and at 5:20 in the morning, interests were still being sorted. I need to go up, Margaret said. To the administrative wing. Yes. Ashby looked at her carefully. You're suspended. Your presence up there could give Voss's team a procedural argument. I know, she said. I'm not going to argue with Voss. I have information the investigators need to hear that isn't in any file. She looked at him. You said this wasn't my burden to carry alone. I'm asking you to get me in the room. He held her gaze for a moment. Give me 2 minutes, he said. He gave her 3, which she used to check the truck driver one more time, verify Tobias had current orders for both patients, and drink approximately half a cup of water from the station sink because she had been on her feet for the better part of 10 hours, and hydration was not a metaphor. It was physiology. Then she followed Ashby into the corridor. The administrative wing of Harrow Creek General at 5:30 in the morning had the specific quality of a place that was accustomed to one kind of activity being subjected, without warning, to an entirely different kind. The hallway leading to the department offices was well lit, carpeted in the institutional blue-gray of a space designed to feel professional rather than warm, with framed certificates on the walls and a ficus and a planter near the conference room entrance that looked like it hadn't been watered in several weeks. The conference room door was closed. Through it, Margaret could hear multiple voices, organized rather than chaotic, the sound of a meeting that had an agenda even if the agenda had not been agreed upon by everyone present. Outside the conference room, in the hallway, stood two people Margaret didn't know, and one she did. The one she knew was Priya Anand, who had changed out of surgical gear into street clothes, but still had the demeanor of someone who hadn't slept, standing against the wall with her arms crossed, and a look on her face that said she had been here for some time and was not planning to leave. "What are you doing out here?" Margaret asked. "Waiting to be called in," Anand said. "The state investigator asked me to stay available. She said she'd need me to walk through the Bay 4 case on the record." She paused. "I also sent her the written account, the one you told me to do." "How long ago?" "About an hour." 1 hour. Written, sent, time-stamped, in the investigator's possession before the board chair arrived. Margaret felt the specific satisfaction of a process running correctly. Not cleanly, not easily, but correctly. She turned to Ashby. "I need to be in that room." "Working on it." He had his phone out and was texting someone. The response came within 30 seconds, and he read it, then looked at the conference room door. "Kalowski, the federal investigator, says he can bring you in as a clinical witness. Your direct clinical involvement in the Tran case tonight qualifies you, but the board chair may object. Letter." He knocked twice on the conference room door, a pause. The door opened. The room was fuller than she'd expected. The federal investigator, the man with the document case, whose name was apparently Kalowski, sat at one end of the conference table with a laptop open and a recording device placed in the center of the table. The state investigator in the gray jacket sat to his left with her own documentation. At the far end of the table, Conrad Voss sat in his administrator's jacket with his hands flat on the table in front of him. And beside him was a woman Margaret didn't recognize who had the specific stillness of legal counsel. Miriam Holst sat to Voss's right. She was perhaps 65, with white hair cut close, and the kind of face that had made a lot of decisions over a long career and knew how to hold itself neutral while doing it. The man who had come with her sat one chair removed, phone face down on the table. Holst looked at Margaret when she entered, and there was a moment of assessment that was quick and thorough and gave nothing away. Dr. Kalowski requested the clinical presence of Mrs. Osei as the treating nurse on the Tran case, Ashby said, from the doorway. "Ms. Osei," Voss said. His voice was careful. "Is on administrative suspension, effective, pending review," the state investigator said, without looking up from her notes. "Not termination. She retains clinical standing." Voss's legal counsel leaned close and said something Margaret couldn't hear. "Have a seat, Miss Osei," Kalowski said, gesturing to the chair across from Voss. She sat. Ashby remained in the doorway. What followed was not dramatic in the way that scenes of institutional reckoning are sometimes portrayed. It was slower than that, more procedural, built from the accumulation of documented specifics rather than from confrontation. Kalowski walked through the federal interest in the Tran case, the patient's military health coverage, the nature of the Route 9 incident, the treatment provided, and the timeline of decisions made. He asked Margaret to describe, on the record, her clinical observation in Bay 4, the information she communicated to Dr. Anand, and the outcome. She answered in precise clinical language, not defensive, not elaborate, exactly what she had seen, exactly what she had said, exactly what had happened. Then Kalowski turned to a different section of his documentation, and the temperature in the room changed. He laid out, in the same precise language, the 17 cases that had been flagged in the complaint, not as accusations, as documented discrepancies. Dates, patient identifiers, procedural notations that had been filed and then revised, revision timestamps that didn't align with clinical rationale. He was methodical and unhurried, and Margaret watched Conrad Voss across the table and watched his face do the thing that faces do when a person is working to maintain a composure that is being tested from multiple directions simultaneously. Holst was watching Kalowski, not Voss. That was notable. The legal counsel intervened twice with procedural objections. Both times, the state investigator addressed the objection with specific statutory language that indicated she had anticipated both objections in advance. The second time, the legal counsel's response was shorter and she made a note on her pad that had the quality of a person updating their assessment of the situation. At 6:15, Kalowski set down a specific page from his documentation and said, "Dr. Voss, the revision to the Palmero file on November 14th. Can you walk me through the clinical rationale for that revision?" The room was very quiet. The Palmero file. Margaret didn't know the name specifically, but she saw something in the way Voss looked at the page that told her this was the thread Kalowski had been building toward. Not the most recent case. Not the flagged 17. One specific case, one specific revision, one specific timestamp. Voss looked at his counsel. His counsel said carefully, "Dr. Voss is reviewing the documentation. The revision was made at 11:42 p.m. on November 14th, Kalowski said, 14 hours after the patient was discharged. The original notation indicated a recommendation for follow-up imaging. The revised notation removed that recommendation. The patient was readmitted 6 days later with a condition that the original recommendation would likely have identified. The silence in the room was the kind that contains multiple people not speaking for different reasons. Miriam Holst turned and looked at Conrad Voss directly for the first time since Margaret had entered the room. Voss said, "The revision reflected additional clinical context that became available after the initial notation." "What clinical context?" Kalowski asked. Another pause, slightly too long. "I'd need to review the full file before—" "The full file is on page 47, Kalowski said, and slid the relevant section across the table. Margaret watched Voss pick up the pages. She watched his legal counsel lean over and read simultaneously. She watched the specific quality of silence that follows when two people are reading a document, and both of them understand that the document does not contain what one of them needs it to contain. Miriam Holst cleared her throat. "I think we should take a 10-minute recess," she said. Not to Kalowski, to the room. "I'd prefer to continue," Kalowski said pleasantly. Holst looked at him. Something passed between them. The specific negotiation of two institutional authorities establishing whose process had primacy in this room at this moment. 5 minutes, Kalowski said. Holst nodded. Margaret stood and stepped into the hallway, where Ashby was still positioned with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for things to unfold at their own speed. Anand was still against the wall. The two people Margaret didn't know had moved further down the corridor, and one of them was now on the phone. "The Palmero case," Margaret said to Ashby quietly. "You knew that was the one." "It was the clearest documentation," he said. "Revision outside clinical hours, adverse patient outcome directly traceable, no supporting evidence for the change in recommendation. Who else is in that file?" "3 cases adjacent. Palmero is the clearest, but the others establish pattern rather than isolated incident." He paused. "The board may try to characterize it as a documentation error, a systemic failure rather than an individual act. Is that possible?" "It's possible to argue. It's not possible to sustain under the full timeline." He looked at her sideways. "The former corpsman, Sandra Reeves, she kept her own contemporaneous notes, dated, detailed, not shared with anyone until 3 weeks ago. Her notes cover the period before and after the Palmero revision." Margaret absorbed this. Sandra Reeves, who had worked the overnight trauma rotation and who had been terminated in November under a restructuring rationale, had been keeping notes, had seen enough to know that notes mattered, had waited until there was someone to give them to. "She's more prepared than I was," Margaret said. "She had a different kind of warning," Ashby said. The conference room door opened. Kalowski's assistant, a young woman who had been taking supplementary notes at a chair against the wall, leaned out and said, "We're resuming." Margaret went back in. The 5 minutes had done something to the dynamic in the room. Holst's posture had shifted. Not dramatically, but the careful neutrality had acquired a quality of resolution, as if the recess had been used not for strategy, but for some private decision. Voss's legal counsel had a new page on her notepad and had into something very controlled. Voss himself looked like a man who had made several calculations in the last 5 minutes and had not liked any of the results. Kalowski resumed with the Palmero case for 11 more minutes. He asked specific, narrow questions. He received specific, narrow answers, careful answers, the answers of people operating under legal counsel. And into every space between the question and the answer, the documentation spoke for itself. The revision timestamp, the absent clinical rationale, the patient readmission, the original notation, intact in the system history, because system history could be accessed but could not itself be revised. Then the state investigator took over, and she moved to the staffing decisions. Sandra Reeves, Patterson, the two internal candidates who had not been appointed. Dolores Webb, whose name entered the official record for the first time in this room when the investigator spoke it aloud. At 7:03 in the morning, Voss's legal counsel requested a formal adjournment. Kalowski said the session would conclude at a natural stopping point and that he had approximately 40 minutes of material remaining. The legal counsel said, "My client will not be responding to further questions at this time." Kalowski noted this for the record. He looked at Holst. "Madam Chair," he said, "do you have any questions you'd like to place on record before we adjourn?" Miriam Holst looked at Conrad Voss for a long moment. The look was not angry. It was the look of someone who had approved an appointment, had trusted a process that had been manipulated, and was now sitting in a room with the documentation of what that trust had been used for. "No," she said, "not at this time." The session closed at 7:41. Margaret walked out of the conference room into a corridor where the sun had started, somewhere in the last hour, to make itself felt. Not through windows, because this corridor didn't have windows, but in the way the building's general atmosphere shifts when the day shift arrives, and the overnight staffing begins to hand off, and the hospital starts performing its daytime version of itself. She could hear the elevator. She could hear more voices at the nurses' station down the corridor. The smell of coffee had appeared from somewhere, the institutional coffee that was never quite right, but was always welcome at a certain hour. Anand was still there. She looked at Margaret with the expression of someone who had been waiting to say something for the last 2 hours and had been choosing the right moment. "I looked you up," Anand said. Margaret stopped. "Not online. There's not much online." She paused. "I asked Commander Ashby during the recess. I asked him what your background actually was. Not the vague version, the actual version." "What did he tell you?" Anand looked at her steadily. "That you spent 12 years as a Navy Special Warfare medic. That you completed 3 overseas deployments in environments where the nearest surgical support was sometimes days out. That you trained advanced combat medicine to 2 graduating classes of special operators, and that every person you certified is still active." She paused. "He also told me about a specific incident in your 3rd deployment that resulted in a commendation you never accepted publicly." "I accepted it privately," Margaret said. "I just didn't need it hung on a wall." "You've been working this floor for 6 years," Anand said, "with credentials that would qualify you for a clinical directorship at any hospital in this state." "That's not what I wanted." "I know, but I spent 8 months calling you the Relic behind your back, and I need you to know that I—" She stopped, started again. "I missed that presentation in Bay 4 because I was moving too fast and reading the monitor instead of the patient. You saw it because you read the patient. That's not instinct. That's 12 years of reading patients when monitors weren't available." She let out a slow breath. "I have a lot to learn." "You saved his life," Margaret said. "The surgery was yours. Don't give that away." "I saved his life because you made sure I had something to save." Anand looked at her. "That's not a small distinction." It wasn't. Margaret knew that. She also knew that standing in a hospital corridor at 7:45 in the morning, accepting credit from a colleague she'd spent 6 years watching, have her competence quietly compressed by institutional pressure was not the moment for debate. "Get some sleep," Margaret said, "and eat something. You've been on since yesterday." Anand almost laughed. Almost. She went. The hallway emptied in stages over the next several minutes. Kalowski's team packed their documentation with the efficient specificity of people who had done this before and knew which materials needed to be organized before transport and which could wait. The state investigator, Margaret had learned her name was Flores, had a brief exchange with Ostrowski near the administrative office, and Ostrowski's face during that exchange had the quality of a man revising his understanding of his own situation rapidly. Ashby found her near the corridor intersection. "There'll be a formal notice to Voss by end of day," he said. "The board has been informed of the federal interest. Holst's position—" He paused. "She's not defending him. She wasn't expecting what she saw in that room." "Did you know that? Before tonight?" "We knew she wasn't part of the appointment irregularity. Beyond that—" He shrugged slightly. You can't always read a room before you're in it. Margaret nodded. There's something I need to do, she said. He read her face. Recovery? Yes. Marcus Tran was on the second floor, in the post-surgical recovery ward, in a room at the end of the hall. The morning light was coming in from the east-facing window. Actual light now, not the gray pre-dawn quality, but the specific clear light of a morning that had followed a storm. The sky outside washed clean and very blue. He was awake. She had expected him to be thinner. The face she was looking at was not the 19-year-old face from Ashby's photograph, and that should have been obvious, but it still required a moment of adjustment. He was 38, and he looked it, in the way that people look their age when they've been unconscious for the better part of a night and have woken up in a hospital room without full clarity yet on the timeline. He saw her in the doorway. He didn't say anything for a moment. Neither did she. You look exactly the same, he said finally. I don't, she said. But thank you. She came in, pulled the chair from the wall and sat in it, the way she sat in all chairs, forward, practical, not making herself comfortable. He looked at her for a long moment with the specific expression of someone taking inventory, making sure the person in front of them matches the person they'd been carrying in memory. I heard you pulled the right call on the flank, he said. The attending surgeon pulled the right call. I read the presentation. Same thing. It isn't, actually. He almost smiled, but the pain medication was still heavy in his system, and it made the expression lopsided. You're still doing that thing where you give away the credit. I'm being accurate. You told me that once, he said, when I was in recovery the first time. I'd been trying to thank you for something specific, and you kept redirecting to the team, and eventually I gave up. He paused, breathing carefully in the way that post-surgical patients breathe when the chest muscles are reminding them of their current situation. I was 19. I didn't have the vocabulary yet for what I wanted to say. Marcus, I'm saying it now. His voice was steady in spite of the effort it was taking. You were the only one who stayed with me, the whole time. You didn't have to. The field station had other casualties, some of them worse than me. But you stayed. The others were stable. See, you're doing it again. She stopped. He looked at her. 16 hours, he said quietly. That's how long the extraction took. And you stayed for 16 hours. She remembered those 16 hours in a way that was not linear, not a clean narrative, but a collection of tactile details. The temperature of that room, the sound the ventilation made, the way she had learned by approximately hour 4 exactly how his breathing changed when the pain broke through the medication threshold, and had adjusted accordingly so the breaks were shorter. She had been 28 years old. It had been her second deployment. She had not thought about those 16 hours in quite some time. She had put them in the same interior space where she put everything from that period, not buried, not suppressed, just set aside. The way you set aside a tool you're no longer using but don't want to discard. You didn't have to come here, she said. It came out more quietly than she intended. I know. I wasn't looking for you if that... He paused, adjusted his position slightly, winced. I was doing a training rotation at the facility north of the city. The accident was... I wasn't expecting it. When I came around enough to understand what hospital they were taking me to, I didn't know you were here. I found out... He stopped. When? She asked. When they were loading me. One of the paramedics said the nurse who'd flagged my case. She said the name. He looked at her. It's not a common name. Margaret said nothing. I needed to know it was you, he said. That's all. I needed them to find out and to make sure you knew. I knew, she said. He nodded slowly. The room was quiet. Outside the window, a car moved through the parking lot below, catching the morning light on its roof panel. A bird landed briefly on the outside sill and left again. What's happening downstairs? He asked. Ashby told me the basics. The investigation. It's proceeding. Because of tonight? Or was it already? It was already moving. Tonight? She considered how to characterize it. Tonight made it harder to slow down. He looked at her steadily. Good. It's complicated. I know what complicated looks like, he said. This is still good. She stood, because she had been sitting for a collective total of perhaps 40 minutes in the last 12 hours, and her back was informing her of this, with the specific eloquence of a body that has been running on discipline and has now identified a moment where discipline is temporarily optional. She moved to the door. "Margaret," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression that had none of the lopsidedness of the earlier almost smile. It was direct and clear in the way that things are clear when they've been distilled over a long time into something that doesn't require many words. "Don't disappear again," he said. She held his gaze. She didn't make a promise. She wasn't a person who made promises lightly, and she wasn't ready to make this one specifically, because making it would require an acknowledgement of something she'd been managing from a careful distance for 6 years. The possibility that the quiet life she'd chosen had also been a way of not being known, and that not being known had its own costs that she'd been absorbing slowly enough not to notice. She said, "Get some rest." She stepped into the corridor and pulled the door closed behind her. In the hallway, there was a nurse she didn't recognize, morning shift, new face, who nodded at her as she passed. An orderly with a medication cart. The normal human traffic of a hospital returning to its daytime operational weight. She took the stairs down because the elevator felt slow, and she needed to move. The lobby was different in the morning light. The tactical SUVs were gone from the parking lot. She could see that through the front glass. The night desk had been relieved by the day staff. Everything that had happened in this lobby between 2 and 5 in the morning had left no visible trace, which was either comforting or disturbing depending on how you chose to interpret institutional surfaces. She was crossing toward the main corridor when the overhead intercom clicked on. It was not an emergency code. It was a standard announcement, the kind that happens a dozen times a day in a hospital, routine, administrative, not designed to stop anyone in their tracks. But the name it used made 3 people in the lobby stop simultaneously, including Margaret. "Dr. Osei, please report to the Chief of Medical Operations Office, Dr. Margaret Osei." She stood very still. Not Mrs. Osei, not Miss Osei, not the nurse who overstepped, not the relic, not the dinosaur. Dr. She hadn't used the title in 6 years. She had specifically not used it, had stripped it from her employee profile, had listed only RN on her badge, had allowed the institutional assumption that the woman in the blue scrubs was what the blue scrubs suggested and nothing more. Someone had looked at her record, the full record, not the civilian employment file, the other one. She looked at the intercom panel on this wall, the generic gray box that could not tell her who had made the announcement or what was waiting in the Chief of Medical Operations office, which had been Conrad Voss's office 12 hours ago, and whose occupancy status was now, she realized, genuinely unclear. The lobby was quiet in the particular way of a space where several people are managing the impulse to watch something without appearing to watch it. Margaret looked at the corridor leading to the administrative wing, at the elevator bank to her left, at the lobby doors behind her and the morning light coming through them, and the parking lot beyond, empty of tactical vehicles, the storm-washed sky above it, a blue that had no reason to be as clear as it was. She had not slept. She was suspended. She was wearing yesterday's scrubs, and she had a letter folded against her chest that she hadn't read since the consultation room and wasn't sure she was ready to read again. She walked toward the administrative wing. The door to what had been Voss's office was open. Miriam Holst was standing in the middle of it. Not seated. Standing, with the deliberate quality of someone who has made a decision and has positioned herself to deliver it without the intermediary of a desk between them. Beside her, the man who had come with her from the commissioner's office was near the window, still on his phone, but he turned when Margaret entered and the phone went to his side. "Sit down, Dr. Osei," Holst said. Margaret looked at the chairs in front of the desk. She looked at Holst. "I've been sitting a lot," she said. Something moved in Holst's expression that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "All right," Holst said. "Then I'll be direct." She looked at Margaret with the same thorough assessment she'd applied in the conference room, but closer now, without the table, without the other bodies in the space. "I owe you an apology. The board approved Dr. Voss's appointment on the basis of a process that, I now understand, was not conducted the way I was told it was. That is a failure of oversight that I own, and I'm not here to minimize it." Margaret said nothing. "I'm also here to tell you," Holst continued, "that the performance review filed last night has been suspended pending the conclusion of the federal inquiry. Any adverse notation from that review will be removed from your file. She paused. That's not contingent on anything. It's effective immediately. All right, Margaret said. And I want to know. Holst stopped, and in the stopping was the brief visibility of a person navigating between institutional language and something more direct. She chose the direct. I want to know what you need, not what the board can offer procedurally, what you actually need. Margaret looked at her. It was such an unexpected question, asked in such a plain way, by a woman who had every reason to stay within the procedural frame and had chosen not to, that it took her a moment to process it as a genuine inquiry rather than a formality. She thought about the trauma unit, about Tobias and the truck driver's respiratory flag, about the teenager with the femur who would wake up in a few hours and need someone who knew how to explain the next 2 weeks to a 17-year-old in language that was honest without being crushing. She thought about Sandra Reeves, who had taken contemporaneous notes for months and waited for the right moment to give them to someone who could use them. She thought about Dolores Webb, who had left the field entirely. I need to go back to the floor, she said. Holst nodded, as if this was exactly what she'd expected. That's already arranged, she said. Effective this shift, if you're willing. I'm willing. There's one more thing. Holst glanced briefly at the man near the window, who had been listening but had kept his expression neutral throughout. The commissioner's office has an interest in the broader clinical oversight structure here. They'll be recommending systemic changes, not just to the appointment process, but to clinical review, reporting channels, the documentation of scope decisions. She paused. They're looking for someone to lead that implementation, someone with the clinical background and the institutional knowledge to understand both what should exist and what actually gets built when you're not watching. The room was quiet for a moment. Margaret looked at Holst. She looked at the man near the window, who was now watching her with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have come to a meeting knowing what outcome they're hoping for, but not knowing whether the person on the other side of the room is going to provide it. She thought about 6 years of being Mrs. Osei, about the badge with nothing on it but the name and the unit number, about the choice she had made and why she had made it, and whether the reasons that had made sense at 38 still made sense at 54, with Marcus Tran's letter against her chest, and a lobby that had announced her full title over the intercom that morning without asking her permission. She opened her mouth to respond, and the intercom came on again. Not a routine announcement this time, the tone different, the coded shorthand that every clinical professional in a hospital recognizes before the words catch up. Mass casualty response. Route 9, secondary incident. 17 additional injuries inbound. Estimated arrival, 8 minutes. 17 additional injuries inbound. Estimated arrival, 8 minutes. Margaret was already moving before the intercom finished. She didn't look back at Holst. She didn't finish the sentence she'd been about to speak. The conversation in that office had a shape and a weight that would still be there in an hour, and the 17 people currently in ambulances on Route 9 did not have an hour to wait for her to complete a sentence. She went through the door and into the corridor and toward the stairs, and behind her she heard Holst say something to the man near the window, but couldn't make out the words and didn't try. The stairwell door hit the wall on the way through. She took the stairs at a pace that wasn't quite running, not because she was managing her energy. She was past managing anything at this point, but because running in a stairwell in hospital-grade rubber-soled shoes on a damp morning was a clinical liability, and she was not going to become a patient today. The trauma unit doors opened as she hit the ground floor corridor. Deshawn was coming the other way, scrubbed still from the night before, and she stopped when she saw Margaret. You heard? Deshawn said. Route 9 secondary. 17 incoming, first wave in 7 minutes now. We've got 2 attendings and the overnight resident. Tobias has been here since yesterday. He's barely functional. Who's on for the day shift? Anand is the senior, but she hasn't slept. She's a surgeon, not trauma. Who else? Dr. Featherstone is supposed to be here at 8. Supposed to be. He called in 20 minutes ago. Family emergency. Margaret pushed through the trauma unit doors. The bay was already in transition. The overnight staffers who should have been leaving were staying. The incoming day nurses were arriving faster than their normal rotation suggested. And the overall atmosphere had the specific quality of a clinical space that knows it's about to be stressed past comfortable capacity and is reorganizing itself accordingly. Equipment was being moved, crash carts checked. The supply cabinet near Bay 3 had been left open by someone who'd pulled items and hadn't had a hand free to close it. She closed it. Tobias, she said. He was at the station, running on something that was either a second wind or the physiological last stand of a person who had exceeded their reasonable operational window. He looked up. "Tell me what you've got," she said. He ran through it without notes. 3 bays currently occupied, 2 of the night's patients stable enough to move to general ward, 1, the truck driver, who was her flagged respiratory case and who had developed in the last 90 minutes exactly the irregularity she'd predicted. His oxygen saturation was sitting at 91%, which was not yet a crisis but was the early edge of one. "He needs to go upstairs," she said. "If we're taking 17 incoming, we can't manage a developing respiratory case in the trauma bay. Get a transport team and move him to pulmonary. Tell them my notation is in the chart and the attending needs to read it before they assess him." "He's been asking about his dog again," Tobias said. "His wife came in?" "About an hour ago. She's with him." "Tell the wife to bring the dog." "Not now, later. When he's in the pulmonary ward and has a private room. Tell her it matters for his recovery." She paused. "Hospitals have visitor policies. The pulmonary ward also has a side entrance. I'll speak to the charge nurse." Tobias looked at her for a moment in the way that people do when they've received an instruction that falls slightly outside the formal script, but is clearly correct. "Okay," he said, and picked up the phone. She turned to the rest of the bay. The 3 nurses currently on, 2 night shift staying over, 1 day shift arriving, were named Kira, Darnell, and a woman whose badge said Petra, whom Margaret didn't know. She ran through them the same way she'd run through the bays. Quick assessment, visible capability, what she needed from each. Kira had been here 4 years and was steady under pressure. Darnell was newer but had the specific quality of a person who functions better in chaos than in calm. Petra was an unknown quantity, which meant she went to Bay 1 for now. The incoming patients would be triaged on arrival, and Bay 1 would take the first critical. "When they come in," Margaret said to the 3 of them, standing in the center of the bay with the overhead lights at full and the monitors humming, and the outside world existing somewhere beyond the automatic doors in an ambulance convoy about 4 minutes out. "I need you to talk to me, not around me. If you see something, you say it. If you're not sure, you say that too. Nobody goes quiet in here. Clear?" Kira nodded. Darnell said clear, with the directness of someone who appreciated a sentence that ended with actual information. Petra looked slightly startled, but nodded. "Good," Margaret said. "Let's clear the truck driver." They cleared the truck driver in 6 minutes, which was faster than it should have been, and left the transport team slightly breathless. But the man was in a wheelchair with his oxygen and his IV and his wife at his side. And he looked up at Margaret as they wheeled him past and said, with the particular sincerity of someone who is heavily medicated and has decided this is the moment for truth, "You're the one who kept checking on me." "I was," she said. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded once and turned back to the bay. The first ambulance arrived at 7:58. The secondary incident on Route 9 was a different shape than the night before. Not a pileup, but a structure fire that had started in a vehicle and spread to a rest stop building, reaching 3 other vehicles in the lot before containment. Burns, smoke inhalation, 2 crush injuries from a roof section that had come down. The population skewed older than the highway pileup. Rest stop at 8 in the morning, road trippers and long-haul drivers rather than commuters. The first patient through was a man in his 60s with partial thickness burns on his forearms and chest and smoke inhalation that was presenting at moderate severity, conscious, oriented, in pain, but able to communicate. Margaret took him for the initial assessment herself because he was the kind of patient whose apparent stability could be misleading. Burns always looked better in the first hour than they were going to look in the second and third. She assessed him fast, hands moving, talking to him at the same time. "Can you tell me your name?" "Harold," he managed. "Harold Briggs." "Harold, I'm going to press here. Tell me if the pain changes." He made a sound that was not quite a word. "Stay with me. Look at the light." She checked pupillary response. Even, reactive. "You breathed a lot of smoke. Your lungs are going to be angry with you for the next few days. We're going to help with that. Right now I need you to stay still." She called the inhalation assessment to Kira, who was already pulling the nebulizer setup, and noted the burn depth on both arms with the specific shorthand that the attending physician would need to make treatment decisions. Bay 2 was her recommendation for Harold Briggs, Not critical, but requiring consistent monitoring. She wrote it and moved. Bay 3 took a woman in her 40s, the most severe burn presentation of the incoming group, full thickness on the left hand and partial on the left forearm, the kind of injury that happens when someone reaches into fire to get someone else out and stays a moment too long. She was in significant pain, controlled only by the fact that the nerve endings in the deepest portions of the burn had already been compromised. Margaret assessed her, updated the chart, and called for the burn specialist on the line. Harrow Creek didn't have a burn unit, which meant this woman needed transfer protocols initiated immediately, which meant someone needed to be on the phone with the regional burn center right now while someone else managed the interim care. "Darnell," she said without looking up from the chart, "get St. Carver Burn on the line. Transfer request. I'll have the documentation ready in 4 minutes." "On it," Darnell said, and she heard him moving. The next hour was work in the most complete sense. The kind of work that occupies the entirety of available cognitive space and leaves nothing over for anything else. 3 more patients came in after the first wave, 2 of them presenting with delayed symptoms. A man who had seemed fine on scene, but whose oxygen saturation was dropping in a way that indicated a slower developing inhalation injury, and a teenager who had sustained what initially looked like minor lacerations, but which Margaret, looking at the pattern and depth, suspected involved a structure that wasn't visible on surface assessment. She was right on both counts. The attending who arrived at 8:20, not Featherstone, who was still absent, but a trauma attending named Dr. Barr, who had come in early after hearing about the incoming group, reviewed her notes on both cases and ordered the interventions she'd flagged within 8 minutes of reading them. Barr was 60, experienced, not demonstrative. He moved through the bay with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough to know where every second went. He passed Margaret at the central station at 8:40 and paused. "Your notation on the inhalation case," he said. "The slow track presentation. That's not in the standard intake protocol." "No," she said. "It's a field assessment indicator. Different mechanism, same outcome." He looked at her for a moment with the specific evaluative quality of a physician assessing a clinical judgment they hadn't made themselves. "It's correct," he said. "I know." He almost smiled. Almost. "Good to have you back on the floor, Dr. Osei," he said, and moved on. She stopped. He'd already turned away and was reviewing a chart. He said it the way people say things when they've already read the relevant documentation and are simply acknowledging a fact, not as a performance, not as a statement about the morning's events. Just a clinical professional to another clinical professional, in a trauma bay that needed both of them. She exhaled once, quietly, and went back to work. At 9:40, with the incoming patient stabilized or transferred, the bay returning to a managed state, and Tobias finally, sitting in the break room with food that someone had physically placed in front of him with the instruction that he was not permitted to stand up until he finished it, Conrad Voss walked into the trauma unit. He was not in his administrator's jacket. He was in his regular clothes, dark trousers, a gray shirt, no tie. He looked like a man who had been awake all night and had made the decision to appear anyway, which was either courage or a failure of self-assessment, and Margaret suspected the latter. He stood inside the trauma bay doors and looked at the space with the expression of someone calculating the distance between where they are and where they expected to be, and finding the gap significant. He saw Margaret. She was at the central station updating a chart. She saw him in the same moment and kept writing. He crossed the bay toward her with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided to do something and is not allowing himself time to reconsider. "I need to speak with you," he said. "I'm in the middle of documentation," she said. "It won't take long." She finished the line she was on, set the tablet down, and looked at him. She gave him the same quality of attention she gave most things, direct, without performance, without telling him in advance what the outcome of the conversation was going to be. He looked worse than he had in the conference room. The constructed composure was still there, but it was requiring visible effort to maintain, the way posture requires effort in the last hour of a long day. "I'm going to be requesting a formal review of the investigative process," he said. "The session this morning was conducted without adequate notice, without proper board presence. Miriam Holst was present," Margaret said. "The full board was not. The federal investigator doesn't require full board presence." He looked at her with the expression of a man who knows the argument he's making has holes in it and is making it anyway because the alternative is saying nothing. I've been in medical administration for 16 years, he said. The kind of picture being assembled here. The framing. He stopped. Something moved in his expression that was not entirely calculated. A brief, genuine flash of something that looked like disbelief. The disbelief of a person who has been confident in their own version of events for so long that the existence of a contrary version feels like an error rather than a revelation. I made decisions based on clinical and operational judgment. I have always made decisions based on the Palmero revision, Margaret said. The name landed in the space between them like a door closing. Voss was quiet. The patient was readmitted 6 days after you removed the imaging recommendation, she said. That's documented. The revision timestamp is documented. The original notation is in the system history and cannot be changed because system history is read only. She looked at him. I'm not the investigator. I'm not the board. I'm telling you this because I've been in this building for 6 years, and I've watched 3 nurses lose their jobs, and 2 internal candidates get bypassed, and I've watched care decisions get mediated by administrative convenience rather than clinical necessity, and the person at the center of all of it is standing in front of me asking me to understand his judgment. Voss said nothing. I understand it fine, she said. I just disagree with it. She picked up the tablet and went back to the chart. He stood there for a moment. She was aware of him in the way she was aware of most things, peripherally, completely. But she did not look up again, because there was nothing else to say, and the chart needed to be finished. He left. The trauma unit doors closed behind him. Kira, who had been restocking the supply cabinet near Bay 3 and had very clearly heard the entire exchange, did not say anything. She was a woman of good instincts. At 10:15, Kalowski's assistant found Margaret in the corridor outside the trauma unit. Her name was Vera, early 30s, and she had the particular competence of someone who has been doing complex logistical work for long enough that nothing about a situation requiring complex logistics surprises her. The Federal Review is moving to a formal investigation, Vera said, without preamble. Dr. Kalowski is requesting your formal statement, not the on-record session from this morning, which stands, but a supplementary statement covering your direct observations over the last 6 years. Specific incidents, specific dates, as detailed as your recall allows. That's a long statement, Margaret said. He's aware. He's not setting a page limit. She handed Margaret a card. You can reach me to schedule. It should be within the week, given the timeline. What timeline? Vera looked at her with the slight pause of someone deciding how much to characterize. The board has received the investigative summary, she said. Not the full file, the summary. They're convening an emergency session this afternoon. Another pause. Holst has already indicated she'll be recommending Dr. Voss's suspension pending the outcome of the formal investigation. The vote is expected to be straightforward. Margaret took the card, looked at it. What about the staffing decisions, she said. Patterson and Reeves. Part of the formal investigation. Both women have been contacted. There will likely be a process for addressing the terminations. And Dolores Webb? Also part of the scope. Vera's expression stayed neutral, but something in it suggested she knew who Webb was and what her leaving the field had cost. The commissioner's office is specifically interested in the appointment irregularity. That goes further than Harrow Creek. Voss had a prior posting, and the pattern there is being reviewed in parallel. Margaret thought about that prior posting. A different hospital, a different city, a different set of people who had been managed by the same methodology. The careful structuring of documentation, the quiet elimination of opposition, the cultivation of board relationships through channels that looked procedural and weren't. Different names, same architecture. How many hospitals? She asked. 3, including Harrow Creek, Vera said. Over 9 years. The corridor was quiet for a moment. 9 years, 3 institutions. The Palmero revision was not a deviation. It was an instance of a method that had been refined across a decade and 2 prior postings. Every decision that had felt, to the people on the receiving end of it, like a specific and targeted injustice, was in fact an element of a system that had been built deliberately and maintained carefully. All right, Margaret said. I'll call you this week. Vera nodded and went back the way she'd come. Margaret stood in the corridor for a moment, holding the card. She thought about the 3 hospitals. She thought about every nurse and physician and administrator in those institutions who had experienced the same erosion she'd experienced here. The performance reviews, the scope challenges, the The documentation that didn't quite match the clinical reality. The sense of being slowly maneuvered out of a position by someone who held the institutional levers and knew how to use them without triggering obvious alarm. Some of them had left, like Sandra Reeves. Some had adapted, become smaller, stopped pushing back. Some had probably believed at some point that the problem was theirs. She went back into the trauma unit. The afternoon arrived with the particular quality of a day that has been running at high intensity and has reached its first natural deceleration. Not quiet, not empty, but operating at a pace that the human body can maintain without extraordinary measures. The bay had 2 patients, both stable. Margaret charted, consulted, and moved. At 2:40, Deshawn found her in the supply corridor. "The board meeting," Deshawn said. "It just ended." Margaret looked up. "Holst's recommendation passed," Deshawn said. 6-1. Voss is suspended pending investigation, effective immediately. The one dissenting vote was a board member who, I heard this from Ostrowski, so take it for what it is, has had his own relationship with Voss going back to the prior hospital. "Which board member?" "His name is Aldrich Pemberton. He's been on the board for 5 years. Deshawn paused. Kalowski's assistant was apparently in the room when the vote was announced. She made a call immediately after. I don't know who to. Margaret did not need to guess who Vera had called. If Pemberton had a prior relationship with Voss extending back to the previous institution, and had cast the single dissenting vote in a 6-1 suspension motion, then Pemberton's relationship to the appointment irregularity Ashby had described was no longer peripheral. The thread that Kalowski had identified in the Palmero case had just acquired a new branch. "Is Pemberton still in the building?" she asked. "I don't know." The meeting was downtown at the board's office. "Let Kalowski's team know," Margaret said, "about the prior relationship. If they don't already have it, they need it." "How do I let them know? I don't have—" "Vera," Margaret said. "Kalowski's assistant. Find her number through the federal office." She paused. "Deshawn, you've been here since yesterday afternoon. Go home." "I went home for 3 hours," Deshawn said defensively. 3 hours is not— I came back because Sandra Reeves is here." Margaret stopped. "She came in about an hour ago," Deshawn said. "She's been sitting in the family consultation room on 2. She said she'd wait." The family consultation room. The room with the soft chairs and the lake painting and the tissue box, where Margaret had sat across from Commander Ashby at 2 in the morning with a folder of documentation that had begun an unraveling she was still watching complete itself. She went upstairs. Sandra Reeves was a woman in her mid-40s with dark hair that had been cut short since the last time Margaret had seen her, which had been November, in the hallway of the trauma unit, on what turned out to be Sandra's last day in the building. She was sitting in one of the soft chairs with her hands around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she looked up when Margaret came in with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a thing long enough that the arrival of it requires a moment of recalibration. "You came back," Sandra said. "I never left," Margaret said. "You did." "Fair." Sandra set the cup down. "I heard about the board meeting. Just happened. And the federal investigation, and—" She stopped, looked at her hands briefly. "And the Route 9 case last night. Tran. I recognized the name in the incident notes." She looked up. "He was one of yours." "Yes." "Is he all right?" "He's going to be." Sandra nodded slowly. She looked like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for several months and was in the process of setting it down, which was not as simple as it sounded. Setting down weight you've been carrying for a long time requires recalibrating the muscles that have been compensating, and that process has its own discomfort. "I kept the notes because I didn't know what else to do," Sandra said. "I knew something was wrong. I could see it in the charts, the revisions, the timing. I didn't have the authority to do anything about it officially, and I didn't know who would listen." Ashby's team listened. 3 weeks ago, yes, better than nothing." She paused. "I want to come back." Margaret sat down. "To Harrow Creek?" "I'm not asking you to decide that. I know you're not the administrator." She looked at Margaret directly. "I'm asking you whether you think it's worth trying, whether the thing that drove me out is actually being addressed, or whether the investigation is just—" She made a gesture that encompassed the institutional version of a thing, looking fixed while remaining fundamentally unchanged. Margaret considered the question honestly. She thought about Holst, standing in Voss's office in the morning light, asking what Margaret actually needed. She thought about Barr saying good to have you back. She thought about Kalowski's methodical working through the Palmero file with the patience of someone who had decided that the full truth was going to be in the room before he left it. I think it's real, she said. I think the investigation is real, and Holst is operating in good faith, and the board's awareness of what's been happening has genuinely changed in the last 12 hours. She paused. I also think institutional change is slower than investigation. What's happening now is the start of something, not the end. But worth trying. Worth trying, Margaret said. Sandra looked at her for a moment. Something in her face settled, not into certainty, but into the more manageable state of a decision that has enough to stand on. They terminated me in November, Sandra said. The notice cited operational restructuring. I still have that letter. Add it to Vera's file. Already done. Sandra almost smiled. I emailed it this morning before I drove here. At 4 in the afternoon, with the trauma unit running its lowest patient count since midnight, Dr. Barr found Margaret at the central station and told her she should go home. She told him she would in an hour. He looked at her with the expression of a physician who has been practicing long enough to understand that certain people's relationship to rest is complicated and that direct instruction is not always the most effective intervention. In an hour, then, he said, and went back to the bay. She had 48 minutes of genuine administrative work left, the kind that had been pending since before the overnight events and had accumulated into a pile that was going to cause problems for the morning shift if she didn't address it. She worked through it without drama, updated the transition notes, filed the inhalation case transfer documentation, left a specific note for the incoming overnight charge nurse about 2 patients whose situations had nuances that weren't fully captured in the standard charting format. At 4:40, she picked up her bag. She was passing the door to the administrative corridor when she heard the voice. Not Voss. Voss was suspended and gone. The voice was Pemberton's. She knew this because she had found his name in the board directory on her phone at some point during the afternoon and had found a photograph alongside it. A man in his late 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of face that appeared in institutional photographs and on committee credits, and in the donor lists of organizations that wanted to appear to be doing something useful. He was in the corridor outside the administrative suite, and he was on the phone, and his voice was carrying with the unreflective quality of a person who believes they are in a space that belongs to them. Not going to let this become a public situation, he was saying. The investigation can do what it does. What needs to happen now is a managed narrative. I've spoken to 2 board members who understand what's at stake, and the commissioner's involvement doesn't have to... He turned the corner and saw Margaret. He stopped speaking. She was standing in the corridor with her bag over one shoulder and her badge still on her scrub top, and the particular quality of stillness that she had, the quality that people sometimes misread as absence, but was actually the opposite. Pemberton lowered the phone. They looked at each other for a moment. Ms. Osei, he said. Dr. Osei, she said. Not aggressively, simply accurately. He held her gaze for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating in real time. This was not, she suspected, a woman he had expected to encounter in this corridor, because she was a woman who was supposed to have been managed out of the building months ago by the process that Voss had been constructing, and her presence here was itself a statement about how thoroughly that process had failed. She did not say anything else. She looked at him, and then, deliberately, without hurry, she looked at the phone in his hand. He understood. She watched him understand. The phrase managed narrative, the reference to the commissioner's involvement not having to be whatever it was being. The 2 board members who understood what was at stake. All of it, spoken in a hospital corridor with the acoustics of an institutional space, and the phone still live in his hand. She looked at him steadily for 3 more seconds. Then she continued down the corridor toward the exit. She did not run. She didn't need to. What needed to happen next was already in motion, had been in motion since Kalowski's assistant made a call after the board meeting, since the federal investigation expanded from Harrow Creek to include 2 prior institutions, since someone had pulled the full record and found Dr. Margaret Osei, where they expected to find a nurse with a badge that said nothing about who she was. She pushed through the exit door into the late afternoon light. The air outside had the specific quality of post-storm clarity, washed, bright, colder than the morning had promised. The parking lot was ordinary. Cars, asphalt, the distant sound of the road beyond the tree line. A normal afternoon in a city that didn't know that the hospital at its edge had been running a different kind of machinery for the last 9 years, and that the machinery had just jammed. She got to her car, sat in the driver's seat without starting it. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs, the left breast pocket, close against her chest, and took out the letter. Marcus Tran's letter, folded once, the paper soft now from being carried against her body for the better part of a day. She read it again. The handwriting was uneven. She'd known that. But in the afternoon light, in the quiet of the car, she read it at a pace that wasn't clinical and wasn't efficient and wasn't the speed of someone who had 15 other things requiring her attention. The letter was not long. The corpsman who had written it down had done so in practical sentences, transcribing the words as they came, and the result was something that read less like a letter and more like a person talking, with the gaps and the starts and the restarts of someone who has decided to say what they mean regardless of whether it comes out polished. The last line was this: "You showed me what it looked like to stay when leaving would have been easier, and I never forgot it, and I hope you haven't either." She folded the letter back along its crease. She put it in her bag, not her pocket this time. Her bag, where it would still be there tomorrow. She started the car. She had been awake for approximately 31 hours. She was going to sleep for a minimum of 8 and preferably more, because the body is not a negotiating partner, and she had been running hard on its generosity since the night before, and it was going to present a bill. She was going to call Vera in the morning and schedule the formal statement. She was going to read the offer from Holst and the commissioner's office with something other than pre-dawn exhaustion and decide whether the thing she had spent 6 years stepping back from was something she was ready to step back toward. She was going to check on Marcus Tran. She was going to think about Sandra Reeves and Dolores Webb and the 3 hospitals across 9 years and the number of people who had been managed by a system designed to make descent structurally impossible. She was going to do all of those things. But as she pulled out of the Harrow Creek General parking lot, she became aware of her phone buzzing on the passenger seat. Not a call. A news alert. She didn't read it while driving. She waited until she reached the traffic light at the first intersection, where the city opened out in front of her in the late afternoon light, and she picked up the phone and looked at the screen. The alert was from the regional news service. It had gone live 4 minutes ago. The headline read, "Federal investigation launched into medical administrator at Harrow Creek General. Board member Aldrich Pemberton placed on administrative leave pending inquiry." She read it twice. Administrative leave, not suspension pending review. Not an internal process. Administrative leave, the specific designation that applied when an external body had determined that an individual's continued presence in a role presented an active risk to the integrity of an ongoing investigation. Pemberton had been on his phone in that corridor for less than 40 minutes after she'd passed him. She thought about what he'd said. Managed narrative. Commissioner's involvement. The 2 board members who understood what was at stake. She thought about the phone in his hand, still live, call still connected, while he said all of it within clear acoustic range of a woman who had spent 12 years in environments where the ability to assess a room quickly and quietly was not an abstract skill. She put the phone face down on the passenger seat. The light changed. She drove. In the hospital behind her, in a recovery room on the 2nd floor with afternoon light coming through the east window, Marcus Tran was awake and would shortly be asking the nurse on duty for his phone, because there was something he needed to read that had just appeared in the news, and because there were people who needed to know that the woman they'd been looking for 6 years was exactly where she'd always been, doing the work, in the building, in the same faded scrubs, and that she was, by every available evidence, completely all right, and that she was, by every available evidence, completely all right. She slept for 9 hours, not 8, which had been the plan, and not the fractured surface-level sleep of someone whose nervous system is still running the previous day's events on a loop. Actual sleep, the deep and structureless kind that the body claims when it has finally been given permission. She woke at 6:47 in the morning to gray light through the bedroom curtains and the sound of a garbage truck on the street below. And she lay still for approximately 30 seconds, taking inventory of herself the way she had learned to do in environments where the first minutes of consciousness were operationally significant. She was fine. Not fine as a deflection, fine as an accurate assessment. She made coffee. She did not look at her phone for the first 20 minutes, which was a discipline she had developed years ago and had maintained through habit. The idea being that the first part of the morning belonged to her, and the world's claims on her attention could wait long enough for the coffee to finish. She sat at the kitchen table in the early quiet and drank it and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a skill, and one she'd had to relearn after leaving the service. At 7:15, she picked up the phone. 14 messages. 3 from numbers she didn't recognize. 1 from Ashby, 1 from Vera, 1 from Deshawn, sent at 11:30 the previous night, which read, "Pemberton's out. Also, Tran is asking for your number. I didn't give it. Figured you'd want to decide that yourself. Get some sleep." She read Deshawn's message twice and felt something that was not quite amusement but lived in the same neighborhood. She read Ashby's next. It was brief. "Call when you're up." Things moved faster than expected. She called him at 7:22. He answered on the second ring with the efficiency of someone who had been awake for a while. "How fast?" she asked, without preamble. "Pemberton's administrative leave was formalized by 6 p.m. yesterday," Ashby said. "The phone call. The one he made in the corridor." Vera flagged it to Kalowski within minutes of the board session. They were already building the connection between Pemberton and the prior posting, and that call, he paused. He used the words managed narrative in an active investigation. That's not a terminology problem. That's obstruction territory. What happens to him? The formal inquiry determines that, but he's been removed from any decision-making capacity relating to Harrow Creek or the federal investigation, and his prior relationship with Voss across the two institutions is now fully in scope. He paused. Voss's legal counsel filed a motion yesterday afternoon requesting that the federal investigation be limited to Harrow Creek only. The motion was denied within 3 hours. The prior postings are in scope. Margaret set her coffee cup down. 9 years, 3 hospitals, and the thread that had started with a splenic bleed on a rainy Wednesday night in a regional trauma bay had pulled until the whole structure was visible. "The other hospitals," she said. "Are the affected staff being notified?" "The state health authority in both jurisdictions has been contacted. The notification process starts today." A pause. "It won't be fast. These things aren't fast, but it started." "Good," she said. "There's something else." He sounded slightly more measured than his baseline, which for Ashby was a significant modulation. "Marcus asked me to tell you he'd like to see you when you're ready. Not urgent." His words, "Tell her not urgent. I just want to talk. I'm providing the message without editorial comment." He could have texted. "He doesn't have your number." He could have asked Deshawn. She didn't give it to him. "I know." She picked up the coffee again. "I'll go this afternoon." She called Vera at 8 and scheduled the formal statement for Thursday, which gave her 2 days to organize her recollections into the kind of chronological specificity that a federal record required. She had a good memory, always had. It was occupationally necessary in environments where written notes were sometimes not possible, but she wanted to be accurate rather than just confident, and accuracy on 6 years of documentation required her to think it through without rushing. She went to the hospital at 10. The difference was visible from the parking lot. She had been coming to this parking lot for 6 years. She knew how it looked at different hours, in different weather, in the particular mid-morning light that came off the tree line to the east. What was different today was not the lot itself. The cars, the marked spaces, the ambulance bay entrance off to the left, but the presence of 2 vehicles she didn't recognize parked near the administrative entrance. Not tactical, not law enforcement. Civilian cars with state government plates. The health authority. She went in through the main entrance. The lobby had its normal daytime population. Patients in the seating area, the reception desk staffed, a volunteer with a cart of reading materials doing his slow circuit of the waiting area. The overnight quality of that lobby, the quality of a space rearranging itself around something extraordinary, was gone. It was just a lobby. But the receptionist looked up when Margaret came through the doors and said, "Good morning, Dr. Osei," in a tone that was slightly more deliberate than routine, and the volunteer with the cart looked over and nodded, with the specific quality of a nod that means more than it looks like. She went to the trauma unit. The bay was running its morning configuration. 2 patients from overnight, the day staff in their positions, the monitors at their rhythms. Dr. Barr was at the central station. He looked up, said morning, and went back to his chart with the efficiency of a man who treated the presence of competent colleagues as a given rather than a circumstance requiring comment. That, Margaret thought, was exactly what it should feel like. She took the patient handoff from the night charge nurse, reviewed the 2 overnights, updated her own assessment notes, and began the day. At 11:40, she was in Bay 2 with a patient, a woman in her 50s with a cardiac presentation that was sitting in the ambiguous territory between stable and about to become significantly less stable, when Deshawn appeared in the doorway and made the specific gesture that meant something was happening that Margaret needed to be aware of without creating disruption in the bay. She finished with the patient, updated the chart, communicated her assessment to Barr, and stepped out. "Board is in the building," Deshawn said quietly. "Not a meeting. Holst came in person. She's in the administrative suite with 2 people from the commissioner's office, and she's been asking for you. Tell her I'll be there in 10 minutes. She said no rush. Tell her anyway." She took 11 minutes because she stopped at the nurse's station to clarify a medication order that had been transcribed with an ambiguity that needed resolving before it became a problem, and because the resolution required 2 phone calls and a chart review and could not be compressed further without compromising accuracy. When she reached the administrative suite, Miriam Holst was standing near the window in the same way she'd been standing the morning before, the deliberate posture of someone who has made a decision and is present to deliver it. The 2 people from the commissioner's office were at the conference table with laptops open. They were younger than Kalowski and Flores, which suggested this was the implementation phase rather than the investigative phase. "Dr. Osei," Holst said, "you asked to see me." "I did." Holst looked at her with the direct, assessing quality that Margaret had identified the morning before as genuine, not the performed neutrality of an administrator managing optics, but the real thing, the look of someone who prefers to know what they're looking at. "I want to formally communicate the board's decision from yesterday's session. Not the suspension. You know about that. The other decision." Margaret waited. "The board has voted to authorize a formal clinical oversight restructuring," Holst said. "The scope covers intake documentation standards, scope of practice clarity for nursing and allied health, reporting channels for clinical concerns, and independent review of administrative decisions that affect patient care." She paused. "The Commissioner's office is funding an 18-month implementation. They want someone to lead it, someone who understands the clinical side well enough to design a system that actually functions, and the institutional side well enough not to design something that looks good on paper and collapses in practice." Margaret looked at her steadily. "The offer I started to make yesterday," Holst said, "before the intercom. I remember. I'm finishing it now." Holst met her eyes. "The title would be Director of Clinical Oversight and Practice Standards. It's a new role, no predecessor, no inherited structure. You'd build it." A pause. "The position includes a return to full clinical hours in the trauma unit. We're not asking you to leave the floor. We're asking you to also do this." The room was quiet. One of the commissioner's people was looking at her screen with the careful attention of someone who is not quite managing to appear as if they're not listening. Margaret looked at Holst and thought about 6 years of being called the Relic, about the badge with nothing on it but the name and the number, about Sandra Reeves writing dates and observations in a private notebook for months because she'd seen something wrong and hadn't known who would listen, about Dolores Webb, who had left the field entirely after being bypassed for a role that had then been filled by a process designed to produce a specific outcome. She thought about the residents who came through this unit, Tobias, who had been awake for 22 hours and had still written down the note about the truck driver's dog because she told him it mattered. Anand, who was excellent and had been made smaller by an environment that rewarded compliance over precision. She thought about what it would mean to build something that made those things structurally less likely. Not impossible. She was not naive about institutions, about the friction of change, about the ways that systems develop their own inertia and resist modification, regardless of the quality of the design. She knew that 18 months of implementation was the start of a decade of maintenance. She knew that the people who would come after her in this role would inherit a structure that she built, and that the structure's quality was therefore, in some real sense, her responsibility forward into time. She wouldn't be there to observe. She thought about Marcus Tran in the recovery room upstairs saying, "Don't disappear again." "There are conditions," she said. Holst nodded, as if she'd been expecting this. "Sandra Reeves gets a formal offer of reinstatement. The termination is reviewed and corrected on the record. And I want the same review applied to Patterson. I don't know his full situation, but his termination is in the same scope, and it should be treated the same. Agreed, Holst said. Dolores Webb gets a written acknowledgement from the board of what happened with the appointment process. Not a settlement offer, an acknowledgement. She left the field. She deserves to know officially that the process was compromised. I'll draft it myself, Holst said. And the clinical oversight structure isn't going to be designed by committee, Margaret said. I'll consult. I'll get input from the floor nurses and the residents and the attending physicians and anyone else who has direct experience with where the current system fails. But the design decisions are mine. Holst looked at her for a moment. That's what director means, she said. Not sharply, just directly. Margaret almost smiled. Then yes, she said. I'll take it. She went to see Marcus Tron at 2 in the afternoon. He had been moved from recovery to a standard room on the 3rd floor, still with the east-facing window, still with the afternoon light. And he was sitting up, which was better than the day before, though sitting up was clearly requiring some negotiation with his body. There was a tablet on his lap that he set aside when she came in. He looked better than he had the morning of the surgery, in the specific way that people look better when the physiological crisis has passed, and the face is no longer spending all its resources on managing pain. I heard about the director thing, he said. Fast. Ashby told me. I think he thought I'd find it funny. Do you? A little. He paused. I think it's right. I think you've been doing the work for 6 years without the authority, and doing it anyway is admirable, but doing it with the authority is better. That's a more considered take than I expected at this hour. I've been lying in a hospital bed for 2 days. I've had time to think. He shifted slightly, adjusted his position. Did you read the letter again? Yes? Did it? He stopped, started again. I wrote it in an ambulance. I don't actually know how coherent it was. It was coherent, she said. Good. He looked at her. I meant it. About staying. I carried that with me for a long time, the 16 hours. I don't think I ever properly understood, until I was older and had done things that were hard myself, what it actually cost a person to do that. To stay in a room with someone when leaving is easier and you're tired and there are other things pulling at you. You would have been fine, she said. The extraction was always going to come. Maybe. But you didn't know that in hour 4. She didn't answer that because he was right, and saying so felt like a different kind of conversation than the one she was currently willing to have. There are people I want you to meet, he said, when I'm out of here, the others, the people from the training cohort. They've all asked. I've been sending updates since last night. He paused. Some of them have been following what's happening at Harrow Creek in the news. It's been more public than you probably wanted. Yes, she said. I'm sorry about that part. Don't be. She meant it. The public part is what makes the institutional response durable. An investigation that only lives in official channels can be managed. One that's visible is harder to walk back. He considered this. You've thought about this. I've thought about a lot of things in the last 2 days. He looked at her with the directness of someone who has decided to say the thing they came to say. You did that for us too, he said. Not just Tran the individual, one patient in a bay. By staying here, by doing the work the way you did it for 6 years without recognition, you created the conditions for this. The investigation has teeth because you were here. The patients who would have been harmed by Voss's decisions in the next year and the year after weren't harmed because of what you've been doing quietly for 6 years. He paused. I know you know that, but I think someone should say it out loud. She looked at the window. The afternoon light was doing what it did in autumn, going golden and slightly lateral, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look more significant than they are. The parking lot below, the tree line, the road beyond it, Route 9, visible in the far distance as a gray line between buildings. She thought about what he'd said. She thought about whether it was true, and she decided that it was, in part. The part that was true. That presence matters. That staying in a room, a building, a situation, a life, when leaving would be easier, creates conditions that don't exist in your absence. You don't always see those conditions form. You don't get a report on them. They simply exist because you were there, doing the work, and people around you were shaped by that whether they knew it or not. The part that was more complicated. She had also stayed because she wanted the quiet life. and the quiet life had been quieter in theory than in practice, and she had spent 6 years being managed by a system that she could see was wrong and had not yet found the moment or the form to address it. That was not a story of pure intention. That was a story of a person navigating competing needs and making imperfect decisions and arriving eventually at a point where the competing needs resolved into something simpler. She had been ready when it mattered. That was what she could say honestly. She had been ready when Marcus Tran arrived in Bay 4, and she had been ready when the investigators arrived, and she had been ready when Holst asked what she actually needed. And being ready was the sum of everything she'd been doing quietly for years, including the years when it hadn't looked like anything from the outside. "I know," "No," she said finally. "Thank you for saying it." He nodded. "Go eat something," she said. "You look like the hospital food has been failing you." "It has been failing me extensively," he said. "I'll talk to the dietary coordinator. They have better options than what they put on the standard tray." "You know the dietary coordinator." "I know everyone in this building," she said. 6 years. She left him smiling. The week that followed was not a clean, linear unfolding of resolution. Real things rarely are. The federal investigation continued at the pace that federal investigations move: thorough, methodical, maddeningly slow at some stages, and startlingly fast at others. Conrad Voss's legal counsel filed 2 procedural objections in the first week, both of which were addressed and set aside. The documentation from the 2 prior institutions arrived in stages, each batch adding detail to the pattern that Kalowski had identified in the Palmero file, and each batch being absorbed into a formal record that was growing into something that was going to outlast everyone's memory of the specific incidents it contained. Voss did not return to Harrow Creek General. That was not technically the final disposition of the matter. The formal proceedings were ongoing, and formal proceedings had their own timeline. But it was the practical reality, and the practical reality was what the people who worked in the building had to live inside. 3 weeks after the night of the Route 9 accident, the State Medical Board issued a formal notice of investigation against Conrad Voss relating to the Palmero case and 4 adjacent cases identified in Kalowski's initial documentation. The notice was public record. It appeared in the regional news on a Tuesday morning alongside a brief statement from the hospital board acknowledging the investigation and confirming that the hospital was cooperating fully. Aldrich Pemberton resigned from the board 4 days later. The resignation was characterized in the official announcement as voluntary and in the interest of the institution. No one who had been in the corridor outside the administrative suite on the morning of the investigation found this characterization particularly accurate, but the practical outcome was the same regardless of the characterization. Sandra Reeves received her reinstatement offer by registered mail on the same Tuesday the medical board notice went public. She called Deshawn within 2 hours of receiving it, and Deshawn called Margaret, and Margaret was in the middle of a clinical oversight framework meeting with 2 of the commissioner's people and told Deshawn she'd call back in 40 minutes. She called back in 38. "She's coming back?" Margaret asked. "She said she needs a week to think," Deshawn said, but the way she said it sounded like a yes that needed to breathe. "That's fine. Let it breathe." Patterson, whose first name was Jerome, which Margaret had not known because she'd never worked with him directly, he'd been in the surgical coordination unit, received his review notification the same week. The outcome was still pending by the time the formal investigation entered its 2nd month, but the process had been initiated and was on the record, and on the record was where it needed to be. Dolores Webb received Holst's letter on a Wednesday. Margaret didn't know this directly. She hadn't been part of drafting the letter and hadn't asked about its receipt. She found out because 2 weeks later, a woman came to the hospital asking for her. Margaret was in the trauma bay when the message came through. She finished the assessment she was in the middle of, handed off cleanly, and went to the lobby. Dolores Webb was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had at some point decided to stop managing what it showed, and had become, as a result, more readable than most. She had left the healthcare field 3 years ago and had been working, Margaret learned in the conversation that followed, in patient advocacy. A different shape of the same work, it turned out, approached from outside the clinical structure rather than within it. "I got the letter," Dolores said. They were in the family consultation room, which Margaret was beginning to think of as the room where the honest conversations happened. "It was more than I expected, from a board." Holst wrote it herself, Margaret said. I know, she told me. Dolores looked at her hands briefly, the way Sandra Reeves had looked at hers. I don't want to come back into clinical administration. I want to be clear about that. What I do now, the advocacy work, I think it's where I'm supposed to be. She paused. But I needed to know that it was real, that what happened to me was real, and that it was documented, and that someone in that building understood it wasn't a failure of mine. It wasn't a failure of yours, Margaret said. I know that intellectually. She looked up. I needed to know that the institution knew it. The institution knows it. Dolores sat with that for a moment. I heard about the oversight role, she said. What you're building. Word travels. Patient advocacy connects to a lot of networks. She paused. When you're building the reporting structures, the channels for clinical concerns, I'd like to consult. Informally. From the outside. I've spent 3 years watching how those channels fail from the patient side, which is a different view than the clinical side. I'll want that view, Margaret said. Good, Dolores said simply. The framework took shape over the following weeks with the specific difficulty of building something new inside an existing structure. Every design decision bumped against existing protocol, existing hierarchy, existing assumptions about how information moved and who was authorized to move it. Margaret had expected this. She had designed field medical protocols in environments where the existing structure was simultaneously the resource and the obstacle, and the skill set transferred, imperfectly and with friction, to the task at hand. She worked with the floor nurses first, not the administrators, not the attending physicians, the nurses, because the nurses were the people whose clinical observations were most often filtered through layers of hierarchy before reaching the people who could act on them. And if the system she was building didn't address that specific failure point, it would look functional without being functional. She worked with the residents next. She ran 2 sessions with the current cohort, Tobias and 4 others, that were not lectures and were not orientations, but were conversations. She asked them what they couldn't say, and to whom, and listened to the answers without taking notes in front of them, because the presence of a notepad changes what people say. She built the reporting structure around what she learned, not around what the existing model assumed. She submitted the framework to the commissioner's office at the end of the 6th week with a 3-page cover document that was not a sales pitch and was not a defense of her choices. It was a clear, specific explanation of what the system was designed to do, how it was designed to do it, and where it was likely to encounter resistance and why. Kalowski read it. He sent 2 comments, both of which were questions about implementation in scenarios she hadn't explicitly addressed. She addressed them. He sent a 1-line response. This is the right architecture. She didn't frame that response and put it on a wall. She filed it and kept working. The formal proceedings against Conrad Voss concluded 5 months after the night of the Route 9 accident. The State Medical Board found substantiated violations across 6 cases, the Palmero file, and 5 additional cases identified in the expanded review. His medical administration license was suspended for 3 years, with conditions attached to any application for reinstatement that included supervised practice and documented remediation across the specific failure areas. The civil proceedings relating to the Palmero patient's readmission were ongoing and would continue to be. The finding was public. The regional news covered it briefly. A larger medical industry publication ran a longer piece about the case in the context of administrative accountability structures in regional hospitals, and the piece referenced the oversight framework being implemented at Harrow Creek as an example of systemic response rather than isolated disciplinary action. Margaret did not give an interview for the piece. She was asked. She declined, not because she had nothing to say, but because what she had to say was in the framework document, and the framework document was a public record, and she preferred to let the work speak in its own voice rather than her personal one. The night the Voss finding was published, she was at the hospital late, not unusually late, just finishing the documentation on a difficult afternoon case that had resolved well, but whose chart required precision. She was at the central station in the trauma bay, the room quiet around her, the monitors running their rhythms, when she became aware that she was not alone. Deshawn was at the door. "You saw the news?" Deshawn asked. "Yes. How do you feel?" Margaret looked at the question for a moment. Not at Deshawn, at the question itself, the honest and plain version of it. Satisfied, she said. Not happy, exactly. Satisfied. She paused. The work that went into this was real, and the outcome reflects it. That's the most you can ask for. Voss is gone, Deshawn said. Pemberton is gone. The oversight structure is actually being built by someone who knows what it needs to do. Sandra starts back on Monday. She paused. I keep waiting for it to feel finished. It doesn't finish, Margaret said. That's the part people don't tell you. The outcome that closes one version of the problem just opens the next version. The question is whether the next version starts from a better position than this one did. She looked at Deshawn. It does, that's enough. Deshawn looked at her for a moment. That's a very you way to think about it, she said. Yes, Margaret said. Marcus Tran was discharged from Harrow Creek General on a Friday morning, 12 days after the Route 9 accident. He walked out on his own, not without effort, his abdomen reminding him with each step of the surgical work that had been done and was still healing, but on his own. He stopped at the nurse's station on the way out and shook Tobias's hand. He stopped in the trauma bay and said something quiet to Kira that made her laugh in a way she clearly hadn't expected. He found Margaret at the central station. She handed him a card. Not her personal contact. Her professional contact. The oversight office, which now had an actual office, an actual number, and an actual email address. In case you need to reach the hospital, she said. He looked at the card, then at her. Can I call this number and ask how you're doing? He asked. No, she said, but you can call Ashby, and Ashby can relay. That's a very inefficient system. I know. He pocketed the card. He looked at her with the expression she had first seen on him in the afternoon light of his recovery room. Direct, undiluted, carrying the weight of everything they hadn't quite said across 19 years. I'm going to come, he said. Not as a patient. When I'm clear for travel, I'm going to come back here. He paused. I want to meet the people you've been building this with. I want to see what it looks like. It's going to look like a lot of paperwork and process meetings, she said. I've done harder things. She looked at him. Something in her chest shifted. Not painfully, not the way it had shifted when she'd first read the letter in the consultation room. Something quieter than that. The specific feeling of a thing that has been stored under pressure for a long time being given room to exist at its actual size. Come back then, she said. He left. She watched him go through the trauma unit doors, through the corridor beyond, out of sight. She heard the lobby doors. She heard nothing after that except the monitors and the building's ventilation and the normal functional sounds of a hospital doing what a hospital is supposed to do. She turned back to the station. There was a chart that needed finishing. There was a meeting with the commissioner's team in the morning about the second phase of the framework implementation. There was a note from the overnight resident about a patient presenting with symptoms that warranted a second look. There was, as there always was and always would be, work. She sat down and did it. She had been doing this kind of work, the precise, patient, unglamorous work of keeping people alive and building structures to keep them safer for 30 years. She had done it under fire, under bureaucratic pressure, under the sustained weight of institutional dismissal, and the more intimate pressure of people who looked at her and saw only what they expected to see and never bothered to look further. She had done it in the absence of recognition and in the absence of credit and in the absence, sometimes, of any visible evidence that it mattered. It had always mattered. This was the thing she had known the whole time, through the performance reviews and the mocking names and the suspension notice and all of the 10,000 small instances of being made to feel smaller than she was. The work had always mattered, independent of whether anyone in the room understood that, independent of whether the right people saw it, independent of whether the badge said anything other than her name and her unit number. There is a particular kind of person who does not stop doing the right thing because no one is watching, who does not need the institution's permission to be competent or the administrator's approval to care, or the approval of anyone with authority over her schedule to know her own value, who understands, at a level below language, that the strength that no one sees is still strength, and that the work that no one credits is still real, and that the moment when all of it is finally visible changes nothing about what it always was. Margaret Osei had always been that person. She had been that person in a forward medical station, at 28, staying in a room for 16 hours because the work required it. She had been that person in a trauma bay at 2 in the morning, reading a patient's flank with hands that knew what they were looking at. She had been that person in a consultation room, a conference room, an administrator's office, a parking lot, a hospital corridor at 5 in the morning with a suspension notice in her bag and a letter against her chest. She had been that person in the quiet years when no one knew her background, and the badge said nothing, and the work went unwitnessed. And she had been that person in the days when everything came into the light, and the person was the same in both versions, which was the whole point. You do not become who you are when someone finally sees you. You were always who you are. The scene is just the world catching up. She finished the chart at 9:47. She flagged the overnight residence note, added her assessment, and left clear instructions for the morning attending. She gathered her bag. She turned off the light at the central station. She walked out of the trauma unit and through the corridor and into the lobby, which had the quiet of a hospital at night. Not empty, never empty, but running at its slower rhythm. The lights dimmed. The day's momentum settled into something more contained. She pushed through the main doors into the night air. It was cold, properly cold now, the season having committed while she'd been spending her days indoors. The parking lot was half empty. The sky above it was clear in the way that cold nights are clear, the stars specific and many. She stopped for a moment outside the door, not because she needed to, just because she was there, and it was quiet, and the air was sharp and clean, and for the first time in a very long time, there was nothing requiring her to be somewhere else immediately. The building behind her was full of people doing the work. Patients and nurses and residents and orderlies and the overnight charge nurse and the volunteer coordinator who came in at 5 a.m. to set up the waiting area and the dietary staff and the maintenance staff and everyone else who constituted a hospital operating in the dark. All of them held, in part, by a structure that was now a little more honest than it had been, a little more designed to notice when something was wrong and allow the people who saw it to say so without cost. She had built that, not alone, and not without difficulty, and not without the contributions of people who had seen more clearly from their specific positions than she had from hers. But she had built it. She walked to her car. She drove home through streets that were quiet and lit and entirely ordinary, through a city that was doing what cities do, continuing, without drama, through the ordinary night. And she did not think about anything in particular, which was itself a form of peace she had not always been able to access. She had been underestimated. She had been managed and dismissed and suspended and looked through and looked past. She had been called the Relic and the Dinosaur, and Mrs. Osei, in the tone that meant the title was a diminishment, and she had absorbed all of it and kept working because the work was the thing that she knew how to do and believed in and was not willing to stop doing, regardless of who in the room could see it clearly. And in the end, not because it was fair, not because the world reliably corrects its mistakes, but because she had been present and prepared at the moment when it mattered. The work had been seen. Not just by a Navy commander in a lobby at 2 in the morning, not just by a former patient who had kept a photograph for 19 years, not just by an investigator who had laid a folder on a table and asked the right questions, by the residents who would practice differently because of what she taught them, by the nurses who would now have a reporting channel that actually worked, by the patients who would never know her name but would be alive because the system that cared for them had been built by someone who understood, from the inside, exactly where it had been failing. That was the work. That was what it had always been. She parked in front of her building, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet. Then she got out and went inside and went to sleep.